It was the summer of 1999 when I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone. I was 26 years old, working a dead-end job in a small town in northern Minnesota, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, and people mostly stuck to their routines. I needed a change, some time away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of work and bills. The plan was simple: pack my gear, drive to a remote state park I'd heard about, and spend a few days alone in the woods. No distractions, no interruptions, just me and nature. I'd been camping a few times before, mostly with friends, but this was the first time I'd go solo. I bought a new tent, some decent camping gear, a small cooler with food, a map, and my old but reliable backpack. I kept it simple. No fancy gadgets or electronics, just the basics. A flashlight, a knife, some matches, a sleeping bag, and enough food to last me a week if I needed it. The drive from my town to the park was about 3 hours. I remember the road getting narrower and rougher the closer I got to the forest. Eventually, it turned into a gravel path that bounced the car around like a toy. The sky was clear that day, the sun bright and warm, and the air smelled fresh. The pine trees lining the sides of the road made the whole place feel alive. I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness as I finally parked my car at the small dirt lot near the park entrance. There was a sign that read Tamarack State Park, warning visitors about wildlife and reminding them to pack out everything they brought in. I grabbed my gear and started walking toward the campgrounds. There were a few other campers scattered around, mostly families or small groups. I wanted to get away from them, so I kept walking deeper into the woods, looking for a more secluded spot. About a mile from the main campground, I found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, mostly pine and birch, with soft moss covering the ground and a small creek running nearby. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent there, careful to clear the ground of sticks and rocks. It took longer than I expected, but I liked doing it myself. Once the tent was up, I laid out my sleeping bag inside and arranged my gear neatly. The sun was starting to drop behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cooler now, and I could hear the soft sounds of birds settling in for the night and the distant croaking of frogs near the creek. After I finished setting up camp, I walked down to the creek to get some water. I filled my bottle carefully, trying to avoid disturbing the clear water too much. The creek was shallow, and the stones beneath the surface were smooth and round. The water was cold, refreshing, and clean. I drank a few sips, enjoying the peacefulness of the place. Then, I walked back to my camp, ready to start a fire. Building a fire wasn't easy. The ground was damp from a recent rain, and most of the wood on the forest floor was too wet to catch fire quickly. I gathered small twigs and dry pine needles, stacking them carefully in a small pile. Using my matches, I lit the fire, blowing gently on the flames until they grew stronger. The fire crackled and popped, sending little sparks into the darkening air. I sat close, feeling the warmth on my face and hands as the last light faded from the sky. That night, I cooked some canned beans over the fire, eating slowly while listening to the sounds of the forest around me. There was no wind, but the trees rustled softly as small animals moved in the underbrush. I felt a sense of calm, a rare feeling that I hadn't experienced in months. I lay back on my sleeping bag just outside the tent, watching the stars appear one by one through the branches above. But as the night deepened, the forest seemed to change. The peaceful noises grew quieter, replaced by strange sounds I hadn't heard before. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the silence making every little noise stand out. Then I started hearing footsteps. Not the light patter of squirrels or birds, but heavier, slower steps that seemed to circle my camp. The sounds were distant, but close enough to make me tense up. I grabbed my flashlight and shone the beam around the trees, but I didn't see anything. The beam caught on a few branches, the rough bark of tree trunks, and patches of moss. No animals, no people. I thought maybe it was just a deer or some other forest creature moving nearby. But the footsteps didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. They were deliberate, steady, and sometimes seemed to stop, only to start again a moment later. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. After all, I was alone out here, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I went back inside my tent and zipped it shut, feeling safer under the thin fabric. I curled up in my sleeping bag, the fire dying down to embers. I wanted to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the sounds outside. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me jump. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps came closer. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard a low grunt, something heavy scraping against the trees. It sounded like someone was moving through the forest deliberately, maybe even watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt frozen, unable to move or even breathe properly. Suddenly, I remembered I had a pocket knife in my backpack. I fumbled for it in the dark and gripped it tightly. I didn't want to think about what could be out there, but my gut told me something was wrong. The footsteps paused right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Then, a loud snap of a branch just a few feet away. My heart slammed against my ribs, pounding so loud I thought the person or animal outside could hear it. I turned on my flashlight again, but the beam only showed empty darkness beyond the tent flap. The sounds stopped suddenly, replaced by complete silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight on low, my knife ready, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning crept through the trees, I packed up everything as fast as I could. The footsteps and strange sounds hadn't returned, but I didn't want to stay longer. As I walked back toward the main campground, I kept my eyes on the shadows between the trees. I didn't want to look behind me, but I felt like something was watching still. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a few minutes, catching my breath. The forest around me looked peaceful in the daylight, but I knew what had happened during the night. That day, back in town, I told myself it was probably just a wild animal or someone else camping nearby, maybe a hunter moving through the woods. But I never found any signs of other people around my camp. No footprints, no trash, no tents. Just the vague feeling that I had been watched by something or someone not meant to be there. I never went back to Tamarack State Park again. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep unease I couldn't shake. The forest seemed friendly in the daytime, but at night, it held secrets I didn't want to uncover. I kept camping after that, but always with friends and never too far from civilization. That night taught me how easily the wilderness could turn from peaceful to threatening, and how alone I really was out there. I still think about it sometimes, the silence that wasn't really silent, the footsteps that circled my tent, and the feeling of being watched. But I never saw anyone or anything, and I never heard those sounds again. Maybe it was just a person, lost or hunting. Maybe it was an animal I didn't recognize. Or maybe my mind played tricks on me, turning shadows into monsters. Whatever it was, it changed me. I learned that being alone in the wild means being vulnerable in ways you can't predict. You can't control the forest or the creatures that live in it. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or legends. They're just real life, and the unknown waiting quietly in the dark. The year was 2017. I was 26 years old, and I had decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the remote woods near a small town called Pine Ridge in northern Minnesota. I had been there once before, years earlier, but only for a day hike with friends. This time, I wanted to test myself, just me, the forest, and my gear. No distractions, no phone signal, no people, just nature and silence. I arrived late Friday afternoon, my old blue Subaru packed tightly with all the things I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, water bottles, a small stove, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a pocket knife. I parked on a small gravel road near the trailhead and grabbed my backpack. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that feels fresh but not cold, with pine and damp earth scents mixing in the breeze. I walked down the narrow dirt trail for about an hour, pushing through thick brush and stepping over fallen branches. The forest was dense, tall pine trees stretching toward the sky. The ground beneath was a mix of needles and moss. Every now and then I heard the sharp cry of a crow or the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I had planned to camp near a small lake I remembered from the old maps. It wasn't marked on the trail signs, so I had to rely on the GPS coordinates I had saved before I lost service. After winding through the trees and crossing a shallow creek by stepping on wet stones, I finally reached the clearing beside the lake just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The lake was small and dark, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the last orange and pink hues of the sky. I set up my tent carefully on a patch of dry ground a few feet back from the water, trying to find a spot with no rocks or roots beneath. It took me almost an hour, but by the time I finished, the light was fading fast. I gathered some dry wood nearby, careful to break off small branches and twigs that would catch fire easily. I had brought a small lighter and some fire starter blocks just in case. Building a fire was important, not just for warmth, but for comfort. There's something about the flickering flames in the dark that feels safe, even when you're alone in the woods. As night fell, the forest grew quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets and the soft lapping of the lake's water against the shore. I cooked a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the fire and drank some water. The fire's light danced on the trees and made the shadows flicker. I decided to take a walk around the lake before heading to bed, carrying my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife. The trees were close, and I had to be careful not to trip on roots or stones. As I circled the lake, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the soft mud near the water's edge. They were large, maybe from a boot or a heavy shoe, and they looked fresh. The prints headed off deeper into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I felt a small spike of unease, but told myself it was probably another camper or a ranger. Still, I made a mental note to be more careful. I turned back and headed to my tent, zipped up inside, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was cold. I wrapped myself tightly and listened to the sounds of the forest. An owl hooting somewhere far off, the crackling of my dying fire, and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to relax and drift off, but sleep was slow to come. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The air was cold against my face, and I realized the fire had died out completely. The tent was dark except for a faint glow from my flashlight's low battery. Outside, I heard a distant sound that made my heart jump. A loud snap of a branch breaking, followed by a rustle that sounded like something big moving through the brush. I froze, listening carefully. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but my mind raced. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, animals that live in the forest and are more afraid of humans than we are of them. I checked my knife on the tent floor and tried to calm down. Still, I lay awake, my ears straining for any more sounds. Eventually, I fell back asleep, but when morning came, I was tired and jumpy. At first light, I decided to explore a bit more. I packed up some food and water and walked deeper into the woods to get my bearings. The forest was thick, and the trail faded quickly into nothing. I relied on my compass and GPS to keep track. After about an hour, I reached a ridge overlooking the lake. From there, I saw smoke rising in the distance, far from where I was camping. I wondered if there were other campers nearby or maybe some kind of controlled burn by the Forest Service. I returned to my camp to find more fresh footprints in the mud, this time mixed with smaller prints that looked like children's shoes. I didn't expect anyone else to be out here, so I felt a bit uneasy. I spent the rest of the day fishing in the lake with a small rod I brought along. The water was cold and clear, but I caught nothing. The solitude was peaceful, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. That evening, I made another fire and prepared a small meal of canned soup. I kept the fire larger this time, wanting to feel safer. As the light faded, the forest sounds grew louder. The calls of animals settling in for the night, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional crack of a twig. Suddenly, I heard it again. A low, heavy breathing, not far from the edge of the trees near the lake. I stopped moving and listened. The sound came and went, sometimes close, sometimes further away. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was steady, slow, like someone breathing hard. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and shone the beam toward the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw a large shape moving between the trunks. It was too big to be a deer or a bear, more like a person. I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to move quickly. I slowly packed up my fire and stuffed the remaining food into my backpack. I zipped up my tent and lay inside, ready to leave at first light. All night, I lay awake, hearing the breathing and movement outside. I never saw the figure again, but the sounds kept me alert. When the sky started to lighten, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything quickly, leaving no trace. I stuck to the trail, but I stayed alert, watching the woods carefully. A couple of miles down the trail, I came across some old camping gear, an abandoned backpack and a pair of muddy boots. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. I moved faster, heart racing. I wasn't sure if I had been near someone dangerous or just a lost hiker. Either way, I didn't want to find out. Finally, after a long walk, I reached the gravel road where I had left my car. The sun was fully up, and the forest looked calm again, like nothing had happened. I locked the doors and sat inside, breathing heavily. The feeling of fear began to fade, replaced by relief. That weekend taught me a lot. Nature is beautiful, but it can be unpredictable. Being alone in the woods means you have to be careful and aware of your surroundings. People can be just as scary as wild animals sometimes. I never found out who was near the lake that night. No signs, no tracks beyond what I saw. Could have been someone lost or someone else camping nearby. But I decided I wouldn't go back alone. Next time, I'd bring a friend, or maybe just stick to more popular spots. The forest is quiet, but it's never empty. I never planned to go camping alone. It just kind of happened. I was 28 years old, living in a small town near the Appalachian Mountains, and I'd been feeling restless for months. Work was draining, and the constant noise of the city was starting to feel like a cage. I wanted to get away, even if just for a couple of days. I wasn't looking for an adventure or a thrill, just some peace in the woods. I packed a simple backpack with a tent, some food, water, and a flashlight, and set off to a small, lesser-known campground about 40 miles from my town. It was called Pine Ridge Campground, tucked away in a quiet valley surrounded by thick forest. The drive was easy enough. I rolled the windows down and let the cool spring air fill the car as I drove past rolling hills and old farmhouses. When I arrived, the campground was nearly empty. A few cars were scattered around, but most of the sites looked unused. I picked a spot near the edge of the woods, right by a narrow creek that ran through the valley. It felt perfect, quiet, isolated, with just the sound of water flowing over stones. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time. The ground was soft but uneven, and roots pushed up here and there, but I managed to find a flat spot just big enough for my small tent. Once the tent was pitched, I unpacked my supplies and made a small fire pit from some rocks I gathered. I had a little portable stove but decided to cook the canned beans and some jerky over the fire for dinner. As the sun sank lower behind the hills, the forest around me started to change. The shadows grew longer and deeper. The air got cooler, carrying the smell of pine needles and damp earth. Birds quieted down, and the only sounds were the gentle rush of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I sat close to the fire, feeling a mix of calm and unease. Being alone in the woods wasn't something I did often, and even though it was peaceful, there was a strange stillness that felt heavier than quiet. I kept the flashlight and my phone close, even though I had no signal. The campsite was too far from town for any cell towers to reach. Night fell fully, and the sky exploded with stars, sharper and brighter than I'd ever seen. I leaned back against a tree stump and let my mind wander. I thought about the noise of my apartment, the constant hum of life I was so used to. Here, all that was gone. It was just me and the forest. I felt small, a tiny part of something much bigger. After a while, the fire burned low, and I decided to crawl into my tent. I zipped it closed and lay down on my sleeping pad, my breath visible in the cool air inside. The quiet felt like a thick blanket, and it was hard to fall asleep. I listened to the creek outside, slow and steady. I told myself it was normal to feel a little on edge, being alone in the dark woods. But then, somewhere deep in the trees, I heard something else, a faint snapping of twigs. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a bird. It was deliberate, slow, and coming closer. I froze. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, a little closer this time. I could hear heavy steps moving quietly but deliberately through the underbrush. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't want to unzip the tent or shine my flashlight outside. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the footsteps were too heavy and steady for a small animal. The woods were alive with sounds, but this felt different. Watching, waiting, the steps circled my tent slowly. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Then, for a long moment, everything stopped. The creek babbled on, the night air was still, and I waited for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps began moving away, back the way they came. My muscles didn't relax until the sounds faded completely into the night. I lay awake for the rest of the night, flashlight by my side, listening carefully. When morning came, I unzipped the tent cautiously. The sunlight spilled in, warming the cool air. Everything looked the same, the creek, the trees, the moss-covered rocks. But then I noticed something new. Just a few feet from my tent, broken branches and crushed leaves formed a rough circle around the fire pit. Something or someone had been there, close enough to see me in the dark. My skin crawled. I thought about packing up and leaving right away, but something made me stay. I told myself to stay calm and rational. Maybe a hiker had passed by while I slept, curious about the fire, but not dangerous. Still, I kept my knife close and made sure to have the flashlight ready at all times. The day passed slowly. I wandered near the creek, collecting fresh water and trying to distract myself. But the feeling of being watched never went away. I caught glimpses of movement at the edges of the trees, a shadow flickering between the trunks, a figure standing still too long in one spot before disappearing. Each time I thought it was my imagination, but the unease grew heavier. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps returned, but this time they were louder, more aggressive. They circled the tent, stopped abruptly. Then one loud snap of a branch close by made me jump. The fire felt fragile in the growing darkness. Couldn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. I kept telling myself that whoever or whatever was out there couldn't get inside the tent. The zipper was strong, and I had no reason to panic. But the fear was real and raw. In the early hours of the morning, I heard voices, low and muffled, just beyond the trees. I didn't recognize the words, but they weren't human conversations I was used to. They sounded harsh, hurried. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I held perfectly still, heart pounding. When the voices faded, the footsteps left again. I waited, exhausted and terrified. By dawn, the forest was quiet again. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The isolation, the presence nearby, it was too much. I packed up quickly, hardly eating or drinking. As I broke camp, I noticed fresh footprints around the perimeter. They were heavy boots and some were smeared with mud. Whoever was out there had been circling me, watching me, maybe even waiting. I didn't look back as I drove away. The trip home was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, the noise and crowds feeling overwhelming but safe. Later, I learned from a local ranger that Pine Ridge Campground, while quiet and pretty, was sometimes used by people passing through the mountains for other reasons. Sometimes hunters, sometimes people avoiding the law. They warned me that being alone out there could be dangerous, not because of wild animals, but because of other humans. I realized then that the scariest thing wasn't the woods or the dark, but the fact that someone else had been close enough to watch me, unseen, without me knowing their intentions. That kind of fear isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about real people and real danger. I didn't go camping alone again, but the memory stayed with me. The cold night, the footsteps around my tent, the feeling of being hunted. It taught me something important about being careful and trusting my instincts. Nature is beautiful and peaceful, yes, but it's also unpredictable, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see. I never forgot those nights at Pine Ridge. Even now, years later, I still feel that quiet fear when I'm alone in the dark. But I also learned to appreciate the safety of company, the warmth of a shared fire, and the simple comfort of knowing you're not alone. That knowledge, that clear difference between being alone and being watched, changed me. I'm still drawn to the woods, but never alone. And when I camp now, I remember that sometimes the most important thing is just to be careful, because the real dangers aren't stories or shadows. They're real and they're closer than you think. It was late September of 1998 when I decided to go camping alone in the northern woods of Vermont. I was 26 years old, a graphic designer from Burlington, tired of the constant buzz of the city and the endless hours stuck in front of my computer. I wanted to disconnect completely for a few days, and the forest, with its early autumn colors, seemed like the perfect escape. I packed my gear carefully the night before: a sturdy backpack, a two-person tent just in case, a warm sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a basic camping stove, some canned food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a reliable map of the area I planned to explore. I didn't want to carry too much. I wanted to move light and fast. I drove 3 hours north, past small towns and dirt roads, until I reached a small parking area near the edge of the Green Mountain National Forest. The place was quiet, with just a few scattered cars and campers. I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness as I strapped on my backpack and stepped onto the trail. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. Leaves crunched under my boots with every step. The trail was narrow but well-marked. I had planned to hike about 6 miles into the forest to find a clearing by a small stream I had spotted on the map. I wanted to camp near running water for easy access and a peaceful sound to fall asleep to. The forest was dense, with tall evergreens and some deciduous trees whose leaves were already turning bright shades of yellow, orange, and red. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the branches. After about 2 hours, I reached a small ridge overlooking the stream. The place was perfect. Flat ground, dry and covered with a thick layer of pine needles, surrounded by trees that gave some shelter from the wind. I decided to set up camp here. I took out my tent and started assembling it. The process was familiar, and I enjoyed the routine of pulling poles through fabric sleeves and securing stakes into the ground. Once the tent was up, I unpacked my sleeping bag and rolled out my small foam pad inside. Next, I gathered some dry wood and pine cones from the forest floor to start a fire. I used my lighter to ignite the kindling and carefully blew on the flames until they grew steady. The crackling fire gave me a sense of comfort. I boiled some water on my camping stove and heated a can of beans for dinner. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the fresh air. After eating, I cleaned up my dishes carefully and stored all food in a sealed plastic bag, tying it to a tree branch away from my tent to avoid attracting any animals. Night came quickly, the temperature dropped, and the forest grew darker. I zipped my tent closed and crawled inside with a flashlight and a book. The sounds of the forest at night were strange and new to me. The hoot of an owl somewhere far away, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and the steady murmur of the stream nearby. I felt calm but alert. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint noise outside the tent. It sounded like something scraping against the tree trunks, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make too much noise. When I shone the light outside, I saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. The noise stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. I tried to relax and fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke to a chilly breeze and fog drifting low over the ground. I packed up camp and continued hiking deeper into the woods. The trail became less clear and more uneven. Branches blocked the path, and patches of mud slowed me down. Still, the forest was beautiful in its solitude. I came across old fallen logs covered in moss and mushrooms, and I saw small animal tracks in the soft earth. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing larger than I expected. It was a perfect spot for another camp, and it was even closer to a wider section of the stream. I set up my tent again and gathered firewood. As I prepared my camp, I noticed something odd. The ground around the clearing was disturbed in several places. The dirt was loose, and there were patches where grass was missing, as if something large had been digging recently. I tried to dismiss it as the work of an animal or maybe the remnants of an old campsite, but the feeling lingered. I inspected the area carefully and saw broken branches about waist-high, bent but not snapped. I considered moving the tent to a different spot, but the sun was already low, and I was tired. That night, the noises outside were louder and closer. Something was definitely moving around the perimeter of my camp. I kept the fire going, hoping the light and smoke would keep any curious animals away. But the sounds of scraping and rustling returned again and again, sometimes with a low grunting or heavy breathing. It felt like something was circling the camp. I stayed inside my tent, flashlight in hand, listening and waiting. The tension was intense, but no direct threat ever showed itself. I tried to stay calm, focusing on breathing and reminding myself that wild animals usually avoid humans. The fire died down as the night grew colder, and I added more wood, feeling the heat spread slowly. In the early morning hours, just before dawn, the noise stopped completely. Exhausted, I slept fitfully until the sun rose and filtered weakly through the trees. The next day, I decided not to stay longer. I packed my belongings quickly, but when I went to gather firewood, I found fresh, large footprints in the dirt near my tent. They looked like a big bear's prints, deep and wide, leading away into the thick forest. My heart sank. I had not seen any bear before, but I knew they lived in this part of the woods. I also knew bears were dangerous, especially if surprised or hungry. I was relieved that the prints were moving away from my camp and not toward it. Without wasting time, I started my hike back toward the trailhead. The forest felt different now, heavier, more alive, and somehow less safe. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees and shadows. Around midday, I reached the main trail. I could see my car parked a few hundred yards away. I walked faster, eager to get back to safety and civilization. Just before reaching the parking area, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the trail, under some bushes, was a crudely made wooden trap. It looked old but functional, a large log balanced on a stick that could fall if triggered. The thought of someone else being out here, setting traps, made me uneasy. What if I had stumbled onto someone's hunting territory? The trap looked dangerous, especially for an unsuspecting hiker or animal. I avoided the trap carefully and hurried the last stretch to my car. I loaded my gear inside and locked the doors. As I sat behind the wheel, I realized I was shaking. Not from cold, but from the raw edge of fear and relief. I had wanted an adventure, but I hadn't expected the quiet woods to feel so alive, so watchful, and at times so threatening. The drive home was long and silent. I stared out at the passing trees and fields, thinking about the nights alone, the sounds, the footprints, and the trap. I understood that nature is beautiful but wild and indifferent. It doesn't owe us safety or comfort. In the weeks after that trip, I kept thinking about the footprints and the noises. I never found out exactly what had circled my camp, but I never wanted to camp alone that deep in the woods again. The experience changed me. It made me respect the wilderness more and reminded me that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the real, raw forces of nature and the unknown people who share those spaces. I remember the weekend like it was yesterday, though it happened a few years ago now. It was the summer of 2017, early August, and I was 26. I had been working a stressful job in a small town in northern Minnesota, and I really needed a break. I decided to go camping alone for a couple of days to clear my head and get away from everything. I wasn't an expert camper, but had done a few trips before, nothing too intense. This time I chose a spot deep in the Superior National Forest near a small lake called Little Basswood. The area was known for its beauty, quiet, and remoteness, exactly what I wanted. I packed my old backpack the night before, making sure I had the basics: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I also had a decent flashlight, a pocket knife, and matches in a waterproof case. I drove my car as close as I could to the trailhead early Saturday morning. The sky was clear and the air smelled fresh, like pine and wet earth. The sun was just rising, casting a golden light over everything. The hike in was about 4 miles through dense forest. The trail was narrow and not very well marked in places, but I had my map and compass and trusted myself to find the way. The forest was thick with tall pine trees and patches of birch. I could hear birds chirping and the distant rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Every now and then, a breeze would stir the branches overhead, causing light patterns on the ground. As I walked, I noticed the ground was soft and damp in places. The previous week had been rainy, and some sections of the trail were muddy. I had worn my hiking boots and they gripped the earth well, but I had to be careful not to slip. The smell of wet moss and pine needles filled the air. I stopped a few times to take pictures with my phone and to catch my breath. The forest felt peaceful and untouched, exactly what I was looking for. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached a small clearing where a creek ran through. The water was clear and cold, and I took a break there, sitting on a fallen log. I filled my water bottle and drank deeply. The sun was warming my back, and I felt relaxed, almost like nothing could go wrong. I stayed there for about 20 minutes, just listening to the water and the quiet sounds of the forest. After that, the trail got a bit steeper. I had to climb over rocks and tree roots. My legs were starting to feel tired, but I kept going. Around midday, I finally reached the lake. It was bigger than I expected. A deep blue, calm and still, surrounded by trees all around. The only signs of life were the occasional splash of a fish jumping and a few birds flying overhead. I found a good spot on the shore, a small flat area with soft dirt and pine needles, perfect for setting up camp. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure and level. Then I gathered some dry wood for a fire and arranged a small circle of stones around it. The sun was high now, and the heat made me sweat under my backpack. After finishing my camp, I went down to the water's edge and washed my face. The cold water was refreshing. I sat down on a rock and ate some trail mix, watching the lake's surface shimmer in the light. As the afternoon passed, the forest started to change in tone. The shadows grew longer and the air cooled. Birds stopped singing, and the only sounds left were the gentle lapping of the lake and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the woods. I was glad to be alone, away from the noise of the town, but I felt a small flicker of unease I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. I spent the rest of the day exploring around the campsite, looking for dry wood and making sure I had enough for the night. The sun was setting fast now, painting the sky in pink and orange hues. I cooked a simple meal on my small portable stove, just some canned beans and rice, and ate it slowly, watching the last light fade away. When darkness fell, I built a small fire. The flames crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows on the trees around me. The night was quiet but full of life. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt calm sitting there, wrapped in my jacket, staring into the fire. But after a while, the feeling of unease came back stronger. I realized that in the deep forest, sounds travel differently. What at first seemed like normal night noises now felt amplified, closer, almost too close. I kept hearing twigs snapping not far from my fire, but every time I looked around, I saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe a fox. But the snapping twigs kept coming, sometimes in quick succession, like something was moving cautiously around my camp. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to listen carefully, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to be coming from all around me. I checked my knife and made sure my flashlight was within reach. The fire was still burning strong, which helped, but the darkness beyond the light felt deep and thick, as if it could swallow me whole. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that animals were common here, and none of them wanted to attack a human. Still, my mind imagined all kinds of things. Maybe someone else was out there, maybe someone who didn't want to be found. I had read stories about people who got lost or worse in these forests. I decided to stay awake for a while, keeping the fire alive and scanning the dark woods with my flashlight beam. Minutes passed, then hours. The snapping sounds eventually stopped, but I didn't dare turn off the light or lay down to sleep. Finally, exhaustion caught up with me. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and switched on my small flashlight inside. I lay on my sleeping pad, my ears straining for any sound outside. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a low sound, a soft, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled slowly across the ground. It was coming from the side of my camp, near the trees. I froze, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The sound stopped after a few seconds, then started again, moving slowly closer to my tent. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. I didn't want to make a noise that would attract whatever was out there. The dragging sound moved along the edge of the clearing, then suddenly stopped right outside my tent. For a long moment, nothing else happened. Then, without warning, a branch snapped loudly nearby. I jumped, dropping my flashlight inside the tent, plunging me into darkness. My hands fumbled around in the black, searching for the flashlight. I managed to switch it back on, the narrow beam cutting through the tent fabric. My mind raced with every possible explanation. Could it be a wild animal? Maybe a bear or a moose? But I hadn't heard any heavy breathing or growling. Then I realized something. The dragging noise wasn't like any animal I knew. It was too deliberate, too slow, as if someone was moving something bulky through the forest, trying not to make too much noise. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I reached for my phone to call for help, but I had no signal. I was truly alone. I sat up slowly, shining the flashlight out of the tent's small window, trying to see what was there. The forest outside was black, but I could make out shapes of trees and bushes. I waited, eyes wide, but nothing appeared. After several minutes, the dragging sound began again, farther away now, moving back into the woods. The snapping branch was replaced by silence. I stayed awake the whole night, clutching my knife and flashlight, eyes open, listening for any sound. When the first light of dawn broke, I finally relaxed a little. The forest looked peaceful and normal in the daylight, but the memories of the night's noises stayed with me. I decided not to stay another night. I packed up my camp quickly, still feeling the tension in my muscles. The hike back felt longer than the way in. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call felt like a reminder of the night before. When I reached my car, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. I locked the doors and sat for a few minutes, trying to calm my shaking hands. The forest behind me looked quiet and safe now, but I knew that something had been out there. Something human, not animal. Driving back into town, I called the local ranger station to report what I heard. They told me the area was sometimes used by illegal hunters or campers who didn't register. They warned me to be careful if I went back. That experience changed the way I saw the wilderness. It wasn't the ghosts or monsters that scared me. It was the real possibility of running into people with bad intentions in a place where no one else was around to help. From then on, I never went camping alone. I made sure to tell someone exactly where I was going and when I would be back. I carried a GPS device and a whistle. I learned how to be more aware of my surroundings and how to stay safe. The forest is beautiful and healing, but it can also be unforgiving. It demands respect and caution. I still love the outdoors, but that night reminded me how important it is to be prepared and to never ignore the feeling that something isn't right. I'm 28 years old. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the mountains of northern Idaho, near a place called Priest Lake. I wanted a quiet break from the city noise, away from work and people. The air in town was always thick with stress, honking cars, and the constant rush to keep up. I needed something different: fresh air, the smell of pine, and a chance to clear my head. I packed my gear carefully the night before. My backpack was heavy but organized. A tent, sleeping bag, water filter, some canned food, a small stove, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my trusted knife. I made sure to have extra batteries and a map, though I planned to rely mostly on the trails. I left early, driving about 2 hours to reach the trailhead near the lake. The sky was clear, the sun just starting to warm the cool morning air. The trail was peaceful. Tall trees, mostly fir and cedar, lined the narrow path. I could hear birds singing, and somewhere in the distance, a faint sound of water flowing. I kept my pace steady, my boots crunching over twigs and dry leaves. The smell of earth and pine needles was calming. I passed a few hikers on the way up, but soon found myself alone. I liked that, no need to pretend or be polite, just me and nature. My plan was to camp near a small clearing I'd heard about 5 miles in. The map showed a little meadow by a creek, sheltered by trees, but open enough for sunlight. I wanted to set up camp early and explore a bit around before nightfall. Around mid-afternoon, I arrived at the clearing. It was more beautiful than I imagined. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the creek water glistened in the sun. I picked a flat spot for my tent, avoiding roots and rocks. Setting up was easy. My tent was light but sturdy. I took off my backpack, feeling the relief of dropping the weight. I spent the next hour gathering firewood, making sure it was dry. The sun was warm but beginning to dip lower behind the mountains. I built a small campfire pit, surrounded by stones from the creek. The air started to cool, and I put on my jacket. The first night was always a little strange. So quiet, so dark. No city lights, no hum of electricity, just the sounds of the forest. After cooking a simple dinner of rice and canned beans on my stove, I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker. The stars came out, bright and countless. I lay back on my sleeping pad, looking up through the opening in the trees, feeling small under the vast sky. The first night was cold but uneventful. I slept well, waking a few times to check the fire. In the morning, I drank water from the creek after filtering it, feeling the cold freshness fill my mouth. I planned to hike a little further up the trail to see a viewpoint the map marked. That day, the forest felt different. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves louder than before. The sky, once bright blue, turned gray with thick clouds. I kept moving, feeling a knot in my stomach but telling myself it was just the weather. About 2 miles from camp, I noticed the trail getting muddy and slippery. The clouds were darker now, heavy with rain. I considered turning back but pushed forward, hoping to reach the viewpoint before the storm. Suddenly, the first drops began to fall. At first light, then heavier and faster. I pulled on my rain jacket and tried to find shelter under the thick branches. The trail became slick, roots slick with wetness. My boots lost traction several times. I kept my head down, focused on the path. Then, I heard a distant rumble, thunder. Not far off, the rain turned into a steady downpour. I was soaked through, and the cold started to seep into my bones. The forest, once welcoming, now felt ominous and claustrophobic. The wind pushed branches, making shadows move in strange ways. On my way back to camp, the rain became a relentless torrent. The creek I had camped beside swelled with water, its banks threatening to overflow. I hurried down the trail, my vision blurred by the rain. My heart beat fast. I realized I was soaked, tired, and cold, and the ground was slippery beneath me. When I reached the clearing, I was relieved to see my tent still standing. But then I noticed something alarming. The fire pit was flooded. Water pooled in the depression where I had made the fire. The firewood I collected was soaked and useless. I couldn't make a fire tonight. I hurried inside my tent, shivering as cold wetness seeped through my jacket and pants. I had extra clothes but nothing dry to change into. My sleeping bag would be damp too, and I dreaded the night ahead. The rain didn't stop. Hours passed, the thunder shaking the forest. At one point, the wind howled so loudly I feared the trees would break. I lay still, listening to branches creak and crash outside. At one point, I heard a loud crack and a heavy thud nearby. Probably a tree or large branch had fallen. I didn't dare look. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke to a strange noise. A dragging sound, slow and steady, close to my tent. My heart pounded. I lay perfectly still, trying to make sense of the sound. It stopped, then started again, a little farther away. The forest was alive with rain and wind, but this was something different. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a bear or maybe a large deer, but the dragging sound was uneven, like something being pulled or carried. I clutched my knife in the dark, sweat and cold making my hands tremble. The rain continued through the night, but eventually morning came. I crawled out of the tent, exhausted and wet. The creek was even higher, rushing fiercely close to the clearing. I felt trapped. I had no phone signal and my GPS device was dead, probably water damaged. I realized I had to find a way out on foot before conditions worsened. I packed what I could, leaving some heavy things behind. The trail was slippery, covered in debris from the storm. Branches and small trees blocked the path in places. I had to climb over or crawl under. At one point, I came across a fallen tree that was too large to cross easily. The water from the creek was rising fast, and I saw the narrow path near the bank was completely washed out. I started to panic. If the water rose much more, I could be trapped. I looked for another way around, heading uphill to higher ground. The forest was thick and my map was useless now, wet and torn. I marked my path by scratching the bark of some trees with my knife. Hours passed, and I was cold, wet, and hungry. My feet were sore and blistered. The rain finally stopped late afternoon, but the sky stayed gray. I kept moving, hoping to find the main trail or some sign of people. Then, I saw something that froze me. A fresh set of tire tracks leading off the trail. Not old, maybe made the day before. It was strange, given how remote the area was. I followed the tracks slowly, my senses on high alert. The forest grew thicker, and the underbrush made it hard to walk. I started to feel like I was being watched. The dragging sound from last night came back into my mind. Suddenly, I heard voices, not loud, but nearby. People talking quietly, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced. I decided to move away quickly, not wanting to reveal my presence. I hurried off the path into the thick woods, trying to find another way out. After walking for what felt like hours, I finally saw a faint glow ahead, like a campfire. It was another campsite occupied by a small group of people. I stayed hidden for a while, watching them. They weren't hikers or backpackers like me. Their trucks were dirty and old. They seemed to be unloading equipment and crates from their vehicles. I didn't want to get close, but I was desperate for help. I waited until dark and then slowly approached the camp. When they noticed me, their expressions changed from curiosity to suspicion. I didn't try to talk. I just showed my empty hands and pointed to my backpack, hoping they'd understand I needed help. One of them nodded and offered some food and dry clothes. They had a small radio and said they had been tracking illegal logging in the area. The rain and storm had damaged roads and cut off communication, and they were stuck here too. They agreed to help me get out the next morning. I spent the night warm and dry in their camp. The next day, with their help, I found a rough dirt road and eventually reached the ranger station. They radioed for rescue teams to clear blocked paths and check on stranded campers. Back in town, safe and dry, I realized how fragile and vulnerable nature could be. What started as a peaceful escape became a test of survival and patience. The storm, rising water, and unexpected people showed me that even the most beautiful places can turn dangerous quickly. I learned to respect the unpredictability of wilderness and always prepare for the worst, no matter how simple the trip seems. That summer, alone in the Idaho forest, I faced fear, exhaustion, and isolation, and came out stronger because of it. I was 27 the summer I decided to go camping alone in the northern Rockies. It was 2019, late July, and I wanted to get away from everything. The noise, the endless emails, the city heat, and the constant pressure at work. I had never camped alone before, but thought it might help me clear my head and maybe reconnect with something simple. I packed my gear carefully, loaded my old Jeep with the essentials, and headed northwest, somewhere deep and quiet, far from the nearest town or highway. After hours driving through winding mountain roads, I reached a small gravel pull-off by a narrow dirt track. The map said there was a trailhead nearby, leading to a camping area a few miles in. The sky was clear blue, and the air smelled fresh, pine needles, earth, a faint scent of wildflowers. I double-checked my backpack. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, first aid, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, compass, a small map of the area, and my phone, which barely had signal out here. The trail was steep and rugged, the kind of path that looked like fewer people used it each year. I followed it as the trees grew thicker, the sunlight filtering through the high branches, casting long shadows on the dirt and rocks below. The forest was dense with fir and spruce trees, their trunks thick and dark with moss. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with pine needles and fallen leaves, muffling my steps. Occasionally, I heard the distant chirping of birds or the rustle of small animals in the brush. I found a clearing a couple of miles in. It wasn't marked or anything official but looked perfect. A small flat spot, surrounded by trees but open enough to see the sky. There was a trickling creek nearby, the water cool and clear, running over smooth stones. I set up my tent carefully, anchoring the stakes firmly because I knew mountain weather could change fast. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, making the sky turn shades of orange and pink. After setting up, I boiled some water and ate a simple dinner, canned beans and rice, some dried meat. The quiet settled in, only the sounds of the forest around me. I tried to enjoy it, sitting by the creek, watching the water ripple over the stones, listening to the soft hum of insects starting their night songs. The air was getting colder as the sun went down. I went inside the tent, zipped it shut, and lay down on my sleeping pad. My phone had no signal, so I put it away. I told myself this was supposed to be peaceful, but I felt a strange tension building. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar silence pressing down on me. The dark outside was thick and deep. I could hear the faint calls of owls and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Suddenly, around 10 p.m., I heard a noise, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, not far from my tent. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. It was closer, more deliberate. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. The sound came again, softer this time, from the left side near the creek. I didn't want to panic, but I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. Outside, the trees were black shapes against the night sky. I shined the beam toward the sound. Nothing, just shadows, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal passing by. Still, I stayed alert, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark woods around me. The creek gurgled quietly nearby. The forest was alive with night sounds, but no more snaps or cracks. I went back inside the tent, zipped it tightly, and tried to calm down. I told myself this was all normal, part of being alone in the woods. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway and creak. I finally drifted to sleep, though every little sound made me twitch awake. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the mesh roof of the tent. The air smelled fresh and damp, and the creek nearby gurgled softly. I stretched and stepped outside, feeling the cool mountain air on my skin. The forest looked different in daylight, less ominous, more alive. Birds flitted through the trees, and the sun made patterns on the ground. I made breakfast and planned to explore more of the trail. Around mid-morning, I decided to hike upstream along the creek, curious about where it came from. The path was slippery with wet rocks and moss. The forest was thick, and the air smelled like pine resin. As I walked, I noticed the ground seemed disturbed in some places. Broken branches, flattened grass, like something big had passed through recently. A few deer tracks in the mud caught my eye, but they looked fresh. I kept going until I reached a bend in the creek where the trees opened up into a small meadow. The grass was tall and golden, swaying in the light breeze. There I saw something strange. A small pile of belongings. A worn backpack, a broken fishing pole, some scraps of cloth. It looked like someone had been here recently and left in a hurry. I felt a cold shiver down my spine. There was no official campsite here, and no trails led this way. I checked around carefully but found no sign of people nearby. The place felt abandoned but also watched. The quiet was heavy. I took a deep breath, decided not to linger, and headed back to my tent. On the way back, I kept my eyes open, scanning the woods, feeling the weight of the silence around me. That afternoon, I worked on making a fire pit near my tent, clearing dry leaves and stones carefully. I wanted a safe fire for the night. The The sun began to set again, painting the sky in red and purple. I gathered some dry wood and kindling and started the fire. The flames crackled, casting flickering light on the trees and rocks nearby. The warmth was comforting, but the shadows it made seemed to dance in unnatural ways. Later, I prepared my dinner, dehydrated stew and crackers, and ate slowly, listening to the forest night come alive again. As darkness fell, I stayed close to the fire, checking my surroundings often. The sounds were louder now, the howls of distant coyotes, the scurry of creatures in the brush. Around 9 p.m., I thought I heard voices, low murmurs, too faint to be clear words. I froze and listened, heart pounding. The voices stopped quickly, replaced by silence. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe animals. Still, I felt uneasy. I packed up the fire and retreated to my tent early, zipped the door shut tight, and sat quietly in the dim light of my flashlight. The forest outside was dark and still, but the weight of the unknown pressed in on me. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the trees. Close by, something big had broken a branch, maybe fell from a tree. I grabbed my knife from the side pocket and switched on my flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and the rough bark of the trees. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the night sounds, flashlight in hand, ready for whatever might come. The next morning, I packed up everything quickly. I felt a deep unease, a feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I didn't want to find out who or what had been nearby. The pile of belongings by the creek haunted me. Who were they? Were they still out there? Did they get hurt? Was there danger? I had no answers. I started hiking back toward my Jeep, moving faster than the day before, eager to leave the forest behind. As I walked, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, large and heavy, that weren't mine. They led parallel to the trail just inside the trees. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept walking, heart pounding. When I finally reached the road and my Jeep, relief washed over me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. Driving away, I realized that sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't ghosts or monsters. It's the presence of other people, unknown and unseen, and the question of what they might be capable of. That trip changed how I think about being alone in the wild. It made me respect the quiet and the isolation, but also made me cautious. I never went camping alone in a remote place again without telling someone exactly where I was going, carrying extra safety gear, and listening carefully to every sound around me. Because out there, in the deep forest, sometimes the fear is real. Not from legends, but from the shadows cast by people you never see and the unknown trails they leave behind. I never thought a simple camping trip would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. My name is Ethan, I'm 27 years old, and this happened just last summer in 2024. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long, stressful spring working 2 jobs, I wanted nothing more than to get away from the noise of the city and spend some time alone in nature. No phone, no people, just the woods. I picked a spot deep inside the Twain National Forest in Missouri. The forest is huge and thick, known for being remote with not many people around. It was perfect. I packed everything carefully. My tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 4 days, my backpacking stove, a first aid kit, a compass, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I told a friend where I was going and when I'd be back, just in case. The drive out was long but peaceful. I arrived at the forest entrance early afternoon and parked my car in the small dirt lot. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a mix of pine and wet soil from recent rains. I double-checked my gear, slung my backpack on, and started walking down the narrow trail. The forest around me was dense, thick trunks of oak and hickory trees standing tall on either side. The canopy blocked much of the sunlight, so the ground was covered in damp leaves, moss, and fallen branches. The air was cool, even though the summer sun was bright. Birds chirped in the distance, squirrels rustled in the bushes, and every now and then, the wind shook the leaves, creating a soft rustling sound. The trail was easy enough to follow at first, marked with small orange ribbons tied to branches. I walked for about 3 hours, stopping only for brief breaks to drink water and eat trail mix. I had decided to set up camp near a small creek I'd seen marked on my map. The sound of running water was soothing, and I wanted a fresh water source close by. When I found the spot, it was perfect. Flat ground surrounded by tall trees, a small clearing with enough sunlight to dry the damp earth. The creek was shallow but clear, water bubbling over smooth stones. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the rainfly was secure and my sleeping bag was inside. I gathered some dry wood for a fire and arranged some stones in a circle. The forest was peaceful here, the creek's steady murmur mixed with the distant calls of birds. As evening approached, I built a fire. Flames licked the dry wood, crackling and sending sparks into the darkening sky. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and some canned beans, eating slowly, listening to the forest around me. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows between the trees. The temperature dropped quickly, and the cool air made me zip up my jacket tighter. Night in the forest is a different world. The darkness felt almost complete. The stars above were bright and countless. The Milky Way stretched like a river of light. I sat by the fire for a while longer, enjoying the quiet, then crawled into my tent to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound seemed louder at night. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl. My mind tried to stay calm, reminding myself it was just nature doing its thing. Still, I found myself waking up every hour or so to check my surroundings. The darkness outside the tent felt like it had weight, pressing in on me. Around midnight, I was woken by a sharp crack, like a branch breaking somewhere not far from my campsite. My heart jumped. I lay still, straining my ears, trying to tell if it was just an animal or something else. The forest was silent again after a few moments. I told myself to relax, that it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling of unease stayed. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, switching it on quietly. The beam cut through the tent's fabric, casting shadows on the trees outside. I looked toward the direction of the sound but saw nothing. My breath came out in small clouds in the chilly air. I lay back down, trying to ignore the noise. Then, faintly, I heard something else. A slow, deliberate rustling in the bushes about 20 feet from my tent. It wasn't like the quick sounds of small animals. This was heavier, like something large moving carefully but purposefully. I stayed frozen, holding my breath. The sound moved slowly from one side of the camp to the other, circling the clearing. My mind raced. It could be a bear, a wild boar, or maybe a coyote, but the way it moved was strange. Not quick, not erratic like an animal searching for food. It felt deliberate, like it was trying to find me. I wanted to call out or make noise, but I was scared that would just attract whatever it was. Instead, I reached for my knife beside me. It was the only weapon I had, a small hunting blade. The rustling stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, nothing happened. I could hear my own breathing, loud and shaky. Then, just outside the tent, I heard a faint scraping noise, like something dragging a heavy object over the ground. Panic surged through me. I fumbled to unzip the tent quietly, shining my flashlight outside. The beam swept over the clearing, but all I saw was darkness and the faint outlines of trees. Suddenly, a heavy thud hit the side of my tent. It was loud enough to shake the thin fabric, and for a moment, I thought the whole thing might collapse. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I gripped the knife tighter, ready to defend myself. The thud came again, slower this time, then nothing. The forest returned to silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, keeping the flames high and bright, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, pale light filtering through the trees, I felt a bit safer. Whatever was out there had disappeared with the dark. Morning was bittersweet. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling slightly. I was exhausted and scared, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I wanted to leave to get back to safety. As I walked back toward the trailhead, I thought about what had happened. The noise, the thuds, the circling movements. It didn't seem like a wild animal. Bears and boars make noise but usually run off if they know people are near. This felt different. When I got back to my car, I noticed deep scratches on the rear bumper. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else out here, and no other cars were around. The scratches were fresh, long, jagged lines, like something had clawed at the paint. That confirmed my worst fears. Later, when I got home, I called the forest ranger office to report what I saw. They told me that occasionally, there were reports of people encountering aggressive wild animals, but nothing confirmed about anything else. They advised me to always camp with a group and carry bear spray. The whole experience stayed with me for months. I kept replaying the night over in my mind, wondering what exactly was there. I never found an answer, and I never went back to that spot. It was a reminder of how alone and vulnerable you can be in the wilderness, and how, sometimes, the scariest things don't come from stories or myths but from real life, right in front of you. I still love camping, but now I always go with friends, and I'm much more careful about where I stay and what I carry. Nature is beautiful, but it can also be dangerous, and that night taught me to respect it more than ever. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone. I was 26, working a demanding office job in Chicago, and the city noise was getting to me. The idea was simple. I'd spend a few days out in nature, away from people, phones, and deadlines. I wanted silence and fresh air, maybe a little time to clear my head. I chose a remote spot in the northern part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I'd heard about a little-known camping area near a lake called Lake Superior's smaller cousin, Lake Goggic. It was deep in the woods, far from highways, cell service barely worked, and the campground was mostly empty this time of year. Early August, just before the school year started again. Perfect. I packed my backpack the night before, checking and double-checking my gear. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cooler nights, a small portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, flashlight, matches, a map, and compass. I even brought a small hand axe and some paracord. I was careful. I'd never been camping alone for more than a night or two before. This time, I wanted to be fully prepared. The drive up was peaceful. The highway slowly dissolved into narrow roads lined with towering pine and spruce trees. The air grew fresher and cooler as I got closer. By late afternoon, I reached the campground, a small clearing near the lake's edge with a few scattered campsites. A few tents were up, but I could tell most people had left for the day. I picked a spot near the water, a bit off from the main path, under some tall trees that offered shade but not too thick to block the view of the lake. The ground was soft with pine needles, slightly damp but firm. I set up my tent quickly, making sure the rain flap was tight, then gathered some dry wood from nearby fallen branches. It smelled of fresh pine and earth. I felt a quiet thrill being out there, surrounded by nothing but trees, the occasional bird call, and the distant sound of the lake's gentle waves hitting the shore. The sun started dipping, painting the sky orange and pink. I made a small fire, cooking some dehydrated stew and boiling water for coffee. I sat close, watching the flames crackle, feeling the cool evening air settle in. After eating, I cleaned up, stuffed my trash in a bag, and put it high in a tree away from my tent to keep critters out. I wasn't expecting bears, but I'd heard stories, so I played it safe. I lay down in my sleeping bag inside the tent, my flashlight off, just listening. The forest sounds were alive. Wind in the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere far off, an owl's distant call. The night was clear and cold. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and eventually fell asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. The silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I'd fallen asleep to, but a heavier stillness, the kind that presses on you. I heard a faint noise outside my tent, like soft footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, my heart picking up pace. The sound stopped after a few seconds, then nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon wandering around. Still, I stayed awake for a while, listening closely, my fingers tightly gripping the flashlight. By dawn, the world outside lightened. The birds started singing again, and the night's tension slowly eased. I packed up my things slowly, had some coffee, and decided to explore a little before leaving. About a mile down the path, I found something odd. A small pile of broken branches and leaves, crushed and scattered, like someone or something had been there recently. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and I could see clear footprints pressed in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They looked human. That made my stomach twist. I looked around carefully, the trees thick on either side. No one was in sight. I checked my phone. No signal. No way to call anyone or check maps online. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself. The footprints headed back toward the lake, toward my campsite. A cold feeling spread through me. I hurried back, scanning the forest. As I neared the campsite, I saw the fire pit was disturbed. The stones were scattered, some ashes thrown around. My backpack was still there, but the small bag of food I'd hung in the tree was missing. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my things and packed up fast. The sun was higher now, but the forest felt different, heavy and watchful. I wanted to leave immediately, but realized my car was parked almost 2 miles away at the entrance. I could walk back through the woods, but I had to go through the same path where I'd seen the footprints. I started walking quickly, eyes darting around, ears straining for any sound. The forest was alive with birds and insects, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. About halfway through, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. Not running, just slow, deliberate. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I waited, heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo in my ears. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was another camper or someone hiking. Maybe I was overreacting. I turned slowly, flashlight in hand, shining it between the trees. Nothing. The shadows stretched long and strange. I walked faster. Then I heard a low sound, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, or a soft rustle. Too soft to make out words. I kept walking, desperate now. The path opened up near a small clearing. There, on a fallen tree, I saw a crude carving. A circle with an X through it, scratched deep into the bark. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt wrong, like a warning. I didn't stop to look longer. I ran. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, doors locked. I didn't even check inside. I jumped in, locked the doors behind me, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The trees faded behind me, and the feeling of being watched slowly left. That night in my apartment, I replayed everything over and over. Who had been out there? Why did they disturb my camp? What did the carving mean? I searched online for similar symbols but found nothing conclusive. The next day, I called the park office. They told me the area was mostly quiet, but sometimes hikers reported strange encounters. Unexplained noises, seeing figures in the distance. Nothing violent, they said, just odd. They advised hikers to stay on marked trails and report anything suspicious. I never went back to that spot. I never camped alone again. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to think I could be completely alone in the woods without risk. The forest isn't empty. People are out there. Some mean no harm, some might just be lost, but others, maybe they're watching, waiting for the right moment. What scared me most wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that someone had been close enough to touch my camp, close enough to know I was there, and that I'd never heard them coming. I still remember the weight of my backpack pressing into my shoulders, the soft crunch of dry pine needles under my boots, and the faint smell of damp earth mixing with the sharp scent of cedar as I trudged deeper into the forest. It was late September of 2011, and I had decided to go camping alone, just me and the wilderness, to disconnect from the noise of city life. I was 28 then, living in a small town in western Oregon, surrounded by thick woods and endless trails. The place I picked was a little-known spot near the foot of Mount Hood, a place I'd heard about from a local hiking forum but had never been myself. I wanted something quiet, off the beaten path, a place where I could think and be by myself. The day had been clear and crisp, the sky a bright blue with just a few wispy clouds. I started my hike mid-morning, carrying only the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water, and some canned food. No phone service was expected, so I didn't bring a charger or extra gadgets. I liked the idea of being disconnected. The trail was narrow, covered with fallen leaves and pine cones. The trees were tall and close, their branches forming a loose canopy that filtered the sunlight in golden patches. As I walked, I could hear birds chirping in the distance and the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was fresh and cool, with that unmistakable smell of pine sap mixed with moist soil. I felt a calm settle in my chest, like the forest was breathing with me. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, the path began to climb gently. I stopped at a small clearing, looking down at the valley below. The view was stunning, layers of green stretching out to the horizon, the river glinting silver far off in the distance. I sat down on a rock to catch my breath and took a sip of water. The silence was profound except for the distant sound of wind through the trees. I felt lucky to be there. I resumed my hike, keeping an eye out for the campsite I'd read about. According to the trail guide, it was near a little stream where the water was clear and cold. Just as the sun started dipping behind the peaks, I found the spot. It was perfect, surrounded by fir trees with soft moss underfoot and the gentle burble of the creek nearby. I set my backpack down and started pitching the tent. The fabric was damp from the morning dew, but the ground was dry enough. It took me about 20 minutes to get everything set up. Once the tent was ready, I gathered some firewood. The forest floor was littered with dry sticks and fallen branches, perfect kindling. I made a small fire pit, arranging the stones in a circle to keep the fire contained. Striking the matches carefully, I soon had a modest fire crackling, casting warm light and shadows all around. The fire's heat was comforting against the growing chill of the evening. I cooked my dinner on the small stove, a simple meal of canned beans warmed up with some instant coffee for later. The food tasted better out here in the wild than it ever did in my apartment. After eating, I cleaned my utensils in the creek, careful not to leave any scraps behind. I always wanted to respect the environment. The sun set completely, and darkness crept into every corner of the forest. I lay back on a blanket, staring up at the stars. The sky was clearer than I'd seen in years, the Milky Way stretching in a pale arc above me. The quiet was absolute, save for the occasional pop from the fire and the soft rush of the creek. It felt peaceful, like the world had paused. I crawled into the tent as the temperature dropped. My sleeping bag was warm, but I could hear the occasional sound of branches swaying outside and the distant calls of night birds. I wasn't scared, but aware that the forest was alive around me in ways the daylight hid. Around midnight, I woke up. The fire had mostly died down, but there was still a faint glow from the embers outside. Something had stirred me, a noise, subtle and strange. I lay still, listening. There was a crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, slow and deliberate, not far from the tent. I froze, heart beating faster. The wind was calm, so it wasn't the wind rustling the trees. It sounded like a person walking slowly, stepping carefully. I stayed quiet, trying to convince myself it might be a deer or a large animal. But the steps were too steady, too human. I reached for my flashlight inside the tent, careful not to make noise, and clicked it on softly. The beam flicked out through the tent fabric, lighting up the trees outside. I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they started. The forest returned to silence. I told myself it was probably a hiker or a hunter who hadn't realized someone was camping here. Still, I felt uneasy. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Every little sound seemed louder. The creak of branches, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote. I tried to focus on my breathing, slow and steady, but my mind raced. At dawn, I woke with the first light, tension still tight in my muscles. I packed up slowly, feeling like I was being watched. There was no sign anyone had come close to the tent, no footprints in the soft earth, nothing disturbed except the faint ashes of my fire. The walk back was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking between the trees. The woods that had felt peaceful now felt cold and silent in a different way, like they were holding their breath. When I finally reached my car, parked at the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. I locked the doors and sat inside, letting the engine warm up. My hands were still shaking slightly, and I realized how exhausted I was. The forest was beautiful, but something about it that night had unsettled me deeply. Driving home, I thought about what I'd experienced. There was no ghost, no monster, no fairy tale. Just a quiet forest and a stranger walking close to my camp in the dead of night. Maybe someone else was out there, lost or looking for something. Or maybe it was just a hunter passing by. But the feeling of being watched, the weight of that silence, it stayed with me long after I left the woods. I never went back to that spot again. But that night taught me something about the wild. It's not always safe, and sometimes the scariest thing is just the unknown person you can't see but know is near. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the constant noise of city life and head out to the woods for a camping trip. I was 27 then and working a job that sucked all the energy out of me. I needed time alone, just me and the silence of nature. I had been camping a few times before, but this trip felt different. I chose a spot I had never been to, a place deep inside the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. The forest was vast and wild, not far from the small town of Warren, but still far enough from the nearest road to feel completely isolated. I packed my old green backpack with the essentials: a small tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a bottle of water, a flashlight, a pocket knife, a map, and a compass. I didn't bring a phone with me. I wanted to disconnect entirely. I left early in the morning, driving my old pickup truck through winding roads that slowly turned from paved highways to dirt tracks. At some point, the GPS stopped working, and I had to rely on the paper map. The sun was warm on my back as I walked down the trail, a narrow path barely wide enough for one person. The forest was alive with the sound of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. The trees towered above me, mostly oak and maple, their leaves thick and green. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. After about 3 hours of walking, I reached a small clearing next to a shallow creek. It was quiet except for the gentle sound of water flowing over smooth stones. I decided this was the place to set up camp. The ground was soft, covered with a layer of dry leaves and pine needles. I found a spot away from the creek's edge but close enough to hear the water at night. Setting up the tent was straightforward. I had done it many times before. Once my tent was ready, I unpacked my gear and settled in. I ate some canned beans and crackers for lunch, then filled my water bottle at the creek after filtering the water with a small portable filter. I spent the afternoon exploring the nearby area, marking some trees on my map so I could find my way back to the camp. As evening came, the forest changed. The light dimmed quickly under the thick canopy, and shadows stretched across the ground. I built a small fire near the tent using dry branches and twigs I collected. The fire crackled and popped, sending a few sparks into the air. I sat close to it, feeling the warmth on my face as the temperature dropped. The sounds of the forest at night were different. Crickets chirped louder, an owl hooted somewhere far away, and the creek's babbling continued. That first night, I slept well. The quiet was comforting, and I felt a strange peace being so removed from the chaos of everyday life. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. I packed a small day bag with some water, snacks, and my compass. I wanted to see a viewpoint I read about in a hiking guide before coming. The trail was harder to follow here, with branches and fallen logs blocking parts of the path. But I was determined. After about 2 hours of climbing uphill, I reached a ridge. The view was breathtaking. I could see miles of dense trees rolling into the distance, a patchwork of greens and browns. The sky was clear and blue, with only a few fluffy clouds drifting lazily. I took a moment to rest and drink water, feeling proud of the effort. As I began my descent back toward camp, I noticed the sky changing. Dark clouds were gathering quickly, the wind picking up. I didn't think much of it at first. Storms were common in these parts. But soon, the first drops of rain fell, light at first, then heavier. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the tent before the storm fully arrived. By the time I got back to camp, the rain was coming down in sheets. The forest looked darker and wetter, the ground slippery and muddy. I hurried to pack my things inside the tent and secure the flap against the wind. The fire was out, the wood too wet to burn. I sat inside, listening to the rain pounding on the thin fabric, the wind shaking the trees around me. Hours passed like this. The storm raged through the night, the noise loud enough to drown out most other sounds. I couldn't sleep well, too alert to the howling wind and the sharp crashes as branches snapped under pressure. The power of nature was both awe-inspiring and frightening. The morning after the storm was eerily still. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and damp. Outside the tent, everything was soaked. The creek was swollen with water, flowing faster and louder than before. I knew I had to be careful walking around now. I packed up my camp carefully, making sure my things were dry enough to carry. As I headed back down the trail toward my truck, I noticed something strange near the creek. A few feet from where I had filled my water bottle the day before, there were deep, large footprints in the mud. They were too big to be human, maybe the size of a large dog or a wolf, but the shape was unusual, almost like a bear's paw, but different. The toes were longer and more spread apart. My heart started beating faster. I had heard stories about bears and other wildlife in these woods, but I hadn't seen any signs until now. I took a photo of the prints with my old camera, trying not to make too much noise. I continued walking, keeping my eyes peeled. The forest felt less friendly now, as if I wasn't alone. I thought about turning back, but I wanted to make it out safely first. Halfway back to the truck, I heard a low growl. It was distant, but clear. My skin prickled. I stopped moving and looked around, but the trees hid everything. The growl came again, this time a bit closer, followed by the crack of a branch breaking. I tried to stay calm, remembering what I had read about dealing with bears or large animals. Don't run, make yourself look big, and slowly back away. I raised my arms above my head, making myself appear larger, and started moving backward carefully. The growling stopped. When I got to a small clearing, I finally saw it. A large black bear standing near some bushes. His eyes caught the light, watching me. It was huge, easily twice my size, thick and powerful looking. The bear didn't move, just stood there, calm but alert. I didn't want to provoke it, so I turned slowly and continued walking back toward the truck, keeping the bear in sight. Once I reached the dirt road, I broke into a faster walk, not looking back until I got to my vehicle. The truck was exactly where I left it, but something felt off. The back tire was flat, and the door handle on the passenger side was scratched up, as if someone or something had tried to get in. My heart pounded again. I had heard of animals scratching at cars, but the marks looked deeper, more aggressive. I grabbed my spare tire and the jack from the back and started changing the flat. Every noise made me jump. A bird taking flight, leaves blowing in the wind. Even my own breathing felt loud. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the trees. I finished changing the tire and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. I started the engine and drove slowly down the dirt road, watching for any signs of movement. The forest seemed darker and more menacing as night approached. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. I turned on the radio, but only static came through. The town was still miles away, but at least I was out of the deep woods. The drive back to Warren was tense. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bear or some other creature chasing me. But the roads were empty. When I got back to my small apartment that night, I unpacked my gear and cleaned the scratches on the truck. The bear tracks, the growl, the flat tire. Everything had happened so fast, so real. I realized that nature was unpredictable, sometimes dangerous in ways you don't expect. After that trip, I never went camping alone again. I still love the outdoors, but I learned to respect the wild, not just for its beauty, but for the quiet power it holds, the unseen creatures that share the woods, and the fragile line between safety and danger. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a week camping alone in the remote woods of northern Michigan. I was 27, and the stress from my job in the city had been piling up for months. The constant noise, the endless emails, and the crowded subway rides made me feel trapped, suffocated even. So, I packed up my gear: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, cooking stove, plenty of water, and some canned food, and set out for a small forest called the Pine Ridge Preserve, a place known for its dense trees, quiet trails, and little foot traffic. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday. The forest was still warm from the day, but the air was cool and sharp with the smell of pine and earth. I chose a spot near a slow-moving creek, the ground flat and clear of thick brush. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were deep and the rainfly was tight. As I worked, I noticed the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the bushes nearby. The forest felt alive but calm, the kind of place where the modern world fell away. After setting up camp, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The stack wasn't large, but enough for a few hours of warmth and light. I was alone, and part of me liked that: the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely disconnected. I started the fire with some matches and kindling I had brought, watching the flames flicker and grow, throwing shadows on the tall trees. That night, I lay on my sleeping pad inside the tent, listening to the creek's gentle burble mixed with the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt peaceful, a rare thing for me. But things changed the next day. I had planned to hike a trail that looped around the ridge, about 7 miles long, and take photos of the wildflowers and landscape. The trailhead was about 2 miles from my camp. I packed my day bag with water, some snacks, my camera, and a map I had printed out. The weather was clear, the sky a bright blue, and the forest canopy filtered the sunlight into a warm green glow. As I walked, the trail was easy at first, soft dirt underfoot, with pine needles and scattered stones. I saw a few deer tracks in the mud and heard woodpeckers tapping nearby. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and after about an hour, I came to a small clearing. The sun hit the clearing fully, and I stopped to rest and drink some water. The silence here was profound. No planes, no cars, just the forest breathing around me. I checked my map. According to it, I was halfway through the loop, about 3.5 miles from my camp. I felt confident and decided to keep going. But then, after a few minutes of walking again, I noticed something strange. The trail began to feel less maintained. Branches blocked parts of the path, and the dirt looked more disturbed, as if animals or people had walked off it recently. I looked closer and saw faint footprints in the mud that weren't mine. They were bigger than mine and heavier. I couldn't tell exactly what made them, but they weren't deer or any normal forest creature. The prints were spaced like a human's, but deeper and wider. I shrugged it off, telling myself it might be from a hunter or a park ranger, and kept moving. An hour later, the trail became even less clear, and the sun was starting to lower in the sky. I realized I might have missed a fork. The forest here was denser, with trees close together and thick underbrush. I pulled out the map again, but the details were hard to read in the dim light. I decided to take a break and figure out where I was. That's when I noticed a noise behind me, a sharp snap of a twig. I froze and listened. The forest was quiet again, but that crack had been distinct, close. My heart sped up. I turned slowly, scanning the trees but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or a bird, but the uneasy feeling stayed. I packed my bag and started walking faster back toward what I thought was the direction of the trailhead. The sun was almost down by the time I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the creek near my camp. I paused and looked down. Everything looked unfamiliar. The creek curved differently, and I realized I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I was lost. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to calm myself, breathing slowly, thinking of the basics: stay calm, find the trail, and don't wander off. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The forest swallowed the reception like a wall. I knew I couldn't stay here all night, so I decided to try and find my way back by following the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to the camp or a road. I walked along the water's edge, the ground slippery and uneven. The shadows were growing longer, and the forest darkened quickly. Suddenly, I heard another twig snap, this time behind me and much closer. I stopped dead. My eyes darted, trying to pierce the dimming forest. I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure maybe, but it disappeared behind a tree. My heart pounded harder. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the way it moved was deliberate, not like any animal I had seen. I picked up my pace, the dry leaves crunching loudly under my boots. The night was coming fast. The forest was no longer welcoming but ominous. I realized I hadn't brought my flashlight on the hike, a stupid oversight I cursed myself for. I wished I had stayed at camp. The creek curved sharply, and I saw the first sign of a trail, faint tire tracks and a broken branch that looked like someone had passed recently. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. The tire tracks led me to an old logging road. The gravel was rough, and the forest on both sides was thick and dark. Relief washed over me. I was no longer completely lost. I walked along the logging road for what felt like miles. The moon was rising, casting pale light through the trees, but I still felt watched. Then I saw a campfire glow through the trees ahead. I moved closer but stayed hidden behind a bush. The fire was small, and beside it were some empty cans and a sleeping bag. The place looked recently used but abandoned. That's when I heard voices, low and muffled, hard to make out from this distance. I stayed back, not wanting to reveal myself. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the firelight. A man, tall and broad, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He looked around, then sat down, pulling a knife from his belt. I backed away quietly, heart racing. Something about him felt wrong. I didn't want to get caught or seen. I turned and started running back down the road, faster than before. My breath came out ragged and loud in the cold air. Branches grabbed at my jacket, and my feet slipped on loose rocks. I didn't stop running until I was sure the fire and voices were far behind. I kept going, desperate to get back to my camp. Eventually, I found the trail again, the well-marked one I had missed before. I followed it, the moonlight now full and bright, lighting the path clearly. I ran all the way back to my camp, arriving exhausted but safe. The fire I had left burning was just a faint pile of embers, but it was still warm. I collapsed inside my tent, locking the zipper tightly. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me jump, but I stayed put until morning. In the daylight, I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to spend another night there. On the hike back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. I never saw the man again. I told myself it was luck and quick thinking that kept me safe. The woods can be beautiful but also dangerous when you least expect it. I learned that being prepared means more than just bringing gear. It means knowing your limits and respecting the unknown. That trip changed how I see the wilderness, not as an escape, but as a place that demands respect and caution. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from work and head up to a cabin in northern Vermont. This was back in October of 2019. I'd just come off a long, stressful stretch at my job in Boston, working on a construction project that had gone sideways in more ways than one. I was tired, mentally drained, and needed some real quiet. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear traffic, didn't want to look at my phone. Just trees, maybe some birds, and my own breathing. That's what I was chasing. I found the cabin through a rental site. It was small, older, one bedroom, buried deep in the woods about an hour outside a town called Jay. The photos showed a wraparound porch, a little fireplace, and no visible neighbors. That was a selling point. I wanted space, solitude. I packed light, just a duffel bag with clothes, a cooler full of food, a few books, a knife, a flashlight, my phone, mostly for emergencies, and some basic tools. I borrowed a friend's 4Runner because my car wouldn't make it on the dirt roads up there. The drive was long and quiet, and the deeper I got into Vermont, the more I relaxed. The leaves were mid-turn, red and orange patches spread across the hillsides. The air started to cool. It felt good to be heading somewhere off the map. I got to the cabin just before dusk. It sat at the end of a long, narrow road that looked barely maintained. The trees on either side were thick and tangled, and the path was just 2 tracks of dirt with grass growing between them. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like something out of the 1960s. Weather-worn wood, moss on the roof, and an old rusted shovel leaning against the porch railing. The windows were small and dusty, but the place had character. More than I expected, honestly. I parked the SUV close to the porch and walked up the creaking steps. The key had been left under a rock near the door, just like the owner told me. I unlocked it and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and cold air. Everything inside was simple: wood floors, a small couch, a table with 2 chairs, a bed with a wool blanket in the corner, and a fireplace made of stone. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just what I wanted. I walked through the place slowly, opening drawers, checking the cupboards. There were a few basics: matches, an old can opener, a stack of firewood inside near the fireplace. Everything was quiet, still. I unpacked, got a small fire going, and heated up some soup on the old propane stove. That night, I sat in a creaky chair near the fire and read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The silence out there was unbelievable. No cars, no people, just the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. The first 2 days went by like that. I took walks down a trail behind the cabin, read, cooked simple meals, and slept deeply at night. My phone stayed off. I started to feel like I was resetting something in my head, like I was finally breathing differently, lighter, calmer. On the 3rd day, things shifted. It started with something small. I woke up and noticed my boots, which I always left by the front door, were turned around. Not far, just pointing the wrong way. I figured maybe I'd kicked them in my sleep or something. Didn't think much of it. Later that morning, I walked out back and noticed something strange near the edge of the woods. A patch of overturned earth like someone had been digging. The soil was loose, and there were shallow claw-like marks through the leaves and dirt. But no paw prints, no animal tracks at all. Just loose dirt and dragged lines. I crouched down to look closer. The lines weren't clean like from a shovel, more like they'd been scraped. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. Then I brushed it off, thinking maybe a deer had kicked around or something. I tried to let it go, but over the next day, more things happened. That night, I went to get more firewood from the pile outside. I'd stacked it neatly when I arrived, but now it looked like someone had pulled pieces out and tossed them aside. A few were broken. I stood there in the dark, holding my flashlight, just looking at the mess. It didn't feel like an animal. It looked too deliberate. I told myself it didn't matter and just brought a few logs inside. But that night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises, sticks cracking outside, what sounded like light footsteps circling the cabin. I got up around 2 a.m. and stood by the window, peeking through the dusty glass. The trees were still. The moon was out, but I had that sick feeling you get when someone's watching you. I tried to go back to sleep, but I left the fire burning lower than usual and kept the flashlight near my hand. The next morning, I found more signs. The cooler I kept on the porch had been moved about 3 feet from where I left it. It wasn't opened, but the latches were scratched. I started walking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for prints, signs, anything, but the ground was mostly dry leaves, and nothing looked obvious. I didn't want to sound crazy to myself, but I started locking the door even during the day. I kept my knife in my pocket at all times and brought the flashlight even when I just stepped out to use the outhouse. I was on edge. I still hadn't seen anyone, but it felt like something wasn't right. That evening, I decided to stay inside and keep watch. I pulled the chair to the window that faced the trail and sat there for hours. The fire was low, and I kept all the inside lights off. Just me, the chair, and the woods in front of me. Around 1 a.m., I saw movement. It was faint, maybe 30 yards out, near where the trail disappeared into the trees. Something moved between the trunks. Not an animal.
Taller.
Slower. I squinted through the glass, barely breathing. Then I saw it again. A figure, just barely visible, standing still between the trees, not moving forward, just watching. I couldn't see a face, couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. It was too dark, but it was a person. I was sure of it. I didn't move. I sat there for at least an hour watching the same spot, but the figure didn't move again. I eventually crept back to the bed and laid there with the flashlight pointed at the door. In the morning, I walked to where I'd seen the figure. I didn't see tracks, but I saw something else. Hanging from a branch about 6 feet off the ground was a strip of cloth. Faded blue, like from a shirt or pants. It was tied loosely, like someone had looped it there on purpose. I didn't touch it, just looked at it and backed away. That afternoon, I started packing. I told myself I'd planned to leave the next day anyway, but that was a lie. I was rattled. I didn't know what I'd seen or who was out there, but I didn't want to wait and find out. I didn't eat lunch, just packed, cleaned up the inside, and made sure everything was ready to go. Then the Forerunner wouldn't start. I turned the key and it clicked once. Then nothing. Tried again. Nothing. The lights on the dash flicked once and went dead. I opened the hood, checked the battery, wires, everything I knew how to do, but I couldn't get it running. I had no cell signal, no internet, no landline in the cabin. The nearest town was about 10 miles down a dirt road with no guarantee I'd find anyone. And it would be getting dark in a few hours. I spent the evening inside, tense and cold. I had no way out until morning, and I didn't want to walk that road in the dark. I sat near the fireplace with the knife in my lap and barely blinked. Every sound outside made me jump. At some point past midnight, I heard something on the porch. Not footsteps, a dragging sound, then a thump, like something was placed or dropped near the door. I didn't move. I just stared at the door for the next hour. I didn't hear anything else. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside. Sitting on the porch right next to the door was my flashlight. I hadn't brought it out there. I kept it inside the whole time. It was covered in dirt and leaves. I picked it up slowly. Still worked, but the lens was cracked. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack, locked the cabin, and started walking. I walked the 10 miles without stopping. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. I didn't see another person the whole time. When I got into town, I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. They drove up with me in a cruiser later that day. We found the cabin untouched. The inside looked just as I'd left it. The cloth was still hanging from the tree, but they didn't seem concerned. They checked the Forerunner and found the battery completely drained. More than it should have been. No signs of animals. No prints. They told me it was probably a vagrant passing through, maybe someone squatting out in the woods, but there was no evidence to follow up on. I took a bus back to Boston the next day. I never went back to the cabin. The owner emailed me to ask how it was, and I never replied. I told myself maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe someone passing through really did just happen to be near the place. But I can't stop thinking about the flashlight. I never brought it outside. I'm sure of that. And someone left it there, right next to the door, like they wanted me to know they'd been watching. I've never stayed alone in the woods again. I still go out sometimes, but only with friends and never too far from a road. That week in Vermont gave me exactly what I asked. I was 31 the summer I took a week off from my job in Omaha and decided to stay in a remote cabin in northern Idaho. It was 2022, and things had been weighing on me heavily. Work, a messy breakup, and just the kind of stress that slowly eats at you day after day until you don't remember what it feels like to wake up without tension in your chest. A friend of a friend had mentioned a small cabin he rented once, tucked deep in the forest near Priest Lake. No cell service, no internet, and nothing around for miles except trees, hills, and sky. That sounded perfect. I booked it without thinking twice. The drive there took almost 16 hours, most of it on winding roads that got more narrow and broken the farther north I went. The last 2 hours were on a gravel road with barely enough space for my SUV. The trees on both sides leaned in so close their branches scraped my windows. It was late afternoon when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, small, wooden, and dark brown, with a slanted tin roof and a narrow porch covered in pine needles. There was a woodpile stacked neatly to the side, and a rusted axe embedded in a stump beside it. The air smelled like damp moss and old leaves. The place looked like it had been built 50 years ago, maybe more. I parked on a patch of flattened grass and shut off the engine. The silence hit me harder than I expected. No cars, no humming of air conditioners, no people. Just the faint creaking of trees and a far-off bird call. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. Inside the cabin, things were simple. One room with a small bed, a narrow table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove. There was a bathroom off to the side with a composting toilet and a tiny sink that only worked when I turned a hand pump connected to a barrel outside. The kitchen area had a propane stove, a few dusty dishes, and a cooler where I'd keep perishables with ice I brought in. There were 3 windows, one above the sink, one beside the bed, and one looking out to the trees in back. Each window had a latch but no screens. I brought in my bags, set up my food supplies, and took a long breath. I felt better already. I had paper, some books, and my trail shoes. I planned to read, hike, maybe write a little. The first night was calm. I made some soup on the stove and sat on the porch while it got dark. The stars were clearer than I'd seen in years, packed across the sky in heavy clusters. I kept a flashlight beside me and left the cabin door open. It cooled off fast after sunset, and the trees creaked in the wind like old doors shifting on their hinges. I went to bed early, and I remember falling asleep fast. The bed was firm but comfortable. It smelled like cedar and dust. I woke up once around 2 a.m. and realized how truly dark it was. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I heard an owl or something far off and went back to sleep. The next morning I felt good. I made oatmeal and coffee on the stove and packed a small bag to explore the woods. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin that led up a ridge. It wasn't marked, but it seemed like someone had used it before. Boots had worn a faint trail, and there were broken branches pushed aside. I walked for maybe 2 hours, climbing higher and deeper into the trees. The farther I went, the quieter it got. At one point, I stopped and realized I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no bugs, just silence. I felt uneasy for the first time, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just not used to being this far from everything. When I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I was sweaty and tired. I sat on the porch again, drank water, and noticed something strange. The axe was no longer stuck in the stump. It was on the ground beside it. That made me pause. I was almost certain I hadn't touched it. I stared at it for a long time, then picked it up and wedged it back into the stump. I told myself maybe I had knocked it over when I unloaded the car or brushed past it. Still, I locked the cabin door that night. The silence outside felt heavier now, like it had weight. On the second night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned all around. I heard branches falling somewhere in the distance. Around midnight, I heard something closer, like crunching leaves near the side of the cabin. I froze in bed, holding my breath. It sounded like footsteps, slow and uneven. Then they stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, not moving. I didn't hear them again. In the morning, I went outside and checked. There were no prints I could clearly see, just some disturbed needles and a broken twig near the back window. I didn't know what kind of animals lived out here, but I figured it might have been a deer or something. Still, I felt different after that. I stopped leaving the door open. I started keeping the hatchet inside at night. I kept my flashlight close, and I looked out the windows more often, watching the trees. On the third day, it rained. Hard. I stayed inside most of the day reading. I cooked some rice and beans and tried to write a little in my notebook, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept hearing sounds outside, like sticks snapping, sometimes soft thuds. I'd get up and look, but I never saw anything. The rain made it worse, blurring the windows and muting sounds in strange ways. That night, I heard something again. This time it was clearer, definitely footsteps. They walked slowly across the porch. I didn't move from the bed. I listened, heart pounding. Then they stopped just outside the door. I didn't breathe. I waited. No knock, no voice, just silence. Then the footsteps moved again off the porch around the side. I sat up and reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just waited in the dark. Eventually, the sounds faded. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. One of the chairs on the porch was moved. It had been pulled back like someone had sat in it, and the axe, again, was on the ground. Not just lying flat, but leaned carefully against the stump. I knew then it wasn't an animal. I checked everything, my car, the food, my bags. Nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, maybe even close by, in the trees, seeing everything I did. I thought about leaving, but part of me felt like I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen anyone, no real proof, and the rental wasn't refundable. I told myself to be more careful. I brought the axe inside. I blocked the door with one of the chairs. I kept the flashlight in my lap while I read. The next night was quiet. Too quiet. No wind. No rain. No animals. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed for most of the night, straining my ears. Nothing happened. But just before dawn, I saw something that chilled me to my bones. Someone had scratched a line into the glass of the window beside the bed. A single, shallow vertical line, maybe an inch long. I hadn't heard anything. Whoever did it had been inches from where I slept. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about the money. I didn't eat, didn't take time to clean. I just shoved my stuff into bags, locked the door behind me, and started the drive back. The gravel road felt even longer this time, like it would never end. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, certain I'd see someone step out from the trees. When I got to the main highway, I finally relaxed a little. I drove all the way to Spokane before stopping. I booked a motel near the airport and stayed the night. I didn't sleep well. Every noise made me jump. I kept the lights on. When I got home to Omaha, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said the cabin was too isolated and not for me. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office in Bonner County. They found my contact info from the rental owner. A hiker had come across an abandoned tent and campsite less than a mile from where the cabin sat. It had rotted gear, some old clothes, and a journal. Inside the journal were entries from someone who said they were watching a man in a cabin and waiting for him to leave so they could go back in. The sheriff asked me if I had seen anyone or heard anything strange while I was there. I told him no. He said they didn't find a body, just signs that someone had been living out there for a long time, off-grid, completely hidden. They figured it was someone with mental issues who had been squatting in the woods and didn't want to be found. I think about that every now and then. I think about how close that person must have been to me, maybe just out of sight behind a tree, watching me through the windows, moving things when I wasn't looking, walking around the cabin while I slept. I think about what would have happened if I stayed just one more night. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stayed in another cabin either. I don't think I ever will. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from everything. My name is Ethan. I was 29 back then, and I had been working nonstop in the city for years. The constant noise, the deadlines, the crowded subway rides. Everything wore me down. I wanted a place far away from the city's chaos. I found a small cabin for rent in a remote part of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. The owner said it was quiet, peaceful, and the perfect place to recharge. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from Albany, along narrow, twisting roads that cut through dense pine forests. When I first saw it, it was just before dusk. The sun was dipping low, the sky painted orange and purple. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by tall pine trees, their needles swaying softly in the cold autumn breeze. It was an old wooden structure, maybe built in the late 1950s or early 1960s. The wood was weathered and gray, but sturdy. It had a porch with a creaky wooden swing, a small stone chimney, and 2 windows that looked out over the thick forest behind it. I unpacked my things slowly. I brought only the essentials. Some clothes, a lantern, canned food, a small first aid kit, and a few books. No TV, no phone signal, no internet. The silence was immediate and total. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear your own breathing and the faint crackling of the dry leaves outside. The first night was calm, if a little chilly. I had brought a wood stove, and after chopping some wood from a small pile near the back of the cabin, I managed to get a fire going. The warmth filled the small room, and the flickering flames cast shadows on the wooden walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I remember feeling a deep kind of peace, like I was finally far enough from the city to breathe freely. The next few days were spent exploring the woods. I walked along narrow trails, crossed small streams, and watched squirrels and birds go about their business. The forest was beautiful, painted with the fiery colors of fall, reds, oranges, and yellows blending with the dark green of the pines. I collected some dry kindling, filled a bucket with water from a nearby spring, and kept my routine simple: eat, read, sleep, and wander. On the third day, I started to notice something odd. Small things at first: a broken branch on the path like something heavy had pushed through it. The footprints around the cabin were a little strange too. There were deer tracks, sure, and some from raccoons, but some prints looked different, larger, heavier, like boots maybe. But I hadn't seen a soul around for miles. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunters had passed through earlier in the season, or someone was hiking nearby and I hadn't met them yet. The forest can play tricks on you when you're alone, I thought. Your mind fills in the gaps. But that night, the sounds grew stranger. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping just outside the cabin window. The moon was bright and full, and I could see the long shadows of the trees. I stayed frozen, listening closely. The snapping came again, slow and deliberate, not like an animal running or jumping, but like someone walking carefully but with purpose. I didn't dare look out. I was alone and I knew it. The door was locked, the windows shut tight. I lit the lantern and sat by the fire, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The next day, I found more signs. On the porch, the wooden swing was pushed aside. It had been hanging still when I left the night before, but now it was pushed right against the wall. There were new footprints in the soft earth near the cabin, large, booted prints that led into the forest and didn't return. I felt trapped. For a moment, I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was still early, and I'd come so far to get away. I told myself to stay calm. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows again. I gathered a few knives from my kitchen and kept them close. That night, the sounds came again. This time, there were whispers outside. Not loud, not clear words, but a low murmur, like people talking just beyond the trees. I pressed my back against the door, heart hammering, but I forced myself to stay quiet and still. The whispers faded after some time, and the forest fell silent again. The following morning, I decided to explore farther away from the cabin. I wanted to see if I could spot anyone or any signs of people nearby. I packed my backpack with water, some food, and a flashlight, and headed down a trail I hadn't taken before. The forest grew thicker and darker. The tall pines blocked much of the sunlight, and the air smelled damp and earthy. After about an hour, I came upon a clearing with an old, rusted car half buried in leaves. It looked abandoned for years. Nearby, there were signs of a campfire, charred wood and ashes cold to the touch. I felt a chill. Someone had been here recently. Someone had used this spot as a camp. Maybe it was the same people I heard last night. I took photos with my small camera. I wanted proof of something, anything. I kept moving, but as I turned to head back, I heard a sound behind me, like a low grunt or a breath. I spun around quickly, but nothing was there. The forest was still and quiet again. I rushed back to the cabin, heart racing. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. Over the next few days, the strange things increased. At night, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. I found strange marks scratched into the wood of the porch, deep gouges, like someone had pressed a knife into it. My food supplies were disturbed. Cans were moved, and I found small scraps of cloth caught on the bushes near the windows. I never saw anyone clearly, only glimpses of shadows between the trees. No voices, just heavy breathing and the crack of twigs underfoot. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. On the 5th day, I decided to leave at first light. I packed my gear quickly, feeling the weight of every second I stayed. The sky was gray and heavy with rain. Before dawn, I checked the door and windows one last time, then stepped outside. I noticed fresh footprints leading from the woods directly to the porch. They were new. Someone had been watching me. I walked briskly to my car. The forest around me seemed alive, tense. Every crackle of leaves underfoot sounded like a warning. My hands shook as I got in and locked the doors. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the trees. A figure standing still, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed on the gas and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. The drive back to the city was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But I didn't. Back in my apartment, safe and warm, I thought about what happened. The fear, the silence, the constant feeling of being watched. I never figured out who or what those people were, or why they chose to stalk that remote cabin. But I learned something important. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're just people. People who choose to stay hidden in the woods, watching, waiting. And when you're alone, they become your worst nightmare. I never went back to that cabin, but the memory of those nights, the sounds, and the feeling of helplessness stayed with me. I understand now how real fear works, how it's not about what's imagined, but what's real, right outside your door. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 33 years old at the time, working as a mechanic in a small auto shop in Erie, Pennsylvania. Life had started feeling like it was happening in fast forward. Same routine every day, same people, same noise. I needed to slow things down. I had a week of vacation saved up, and I thought I'd use it to go somewhere quiet, away from traffic, cell service, and people in general. I booked a small cabin through a rental site. It was located deep in the Allegheny National Forest, almost 2 hours away from any proper town. The listing said it had no Wi-Fi or phone signal and ran on propane and solar panels. The idea of total quiet sounded perfect to me. I packed a duffel with clothes, some food, and a few basic tools just in case. I also brought a small generator and a jerry can of gas. I wasn't expecting to use it much, but I figured it couldn't hurt to have a backup. The drive up was mostly uneventful. I stopped once at a gas station in Warren to grab a sandwich and some extra water. After that, the road got narrower, more broken up. Potholes, overgrown trees, no painted lines. The last 5 miles were dirt road, no signs, just the occasional tire rut. It took me nearly 30 minutes to cover that last stretch. I remember thinking how isolated the place felt even in daylight. But I liked it. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was just how it had looked in the pictures. Small, dark wood exterior, one window in the front, another in the back. A metal roof, a covered porch with an old rocking chair. A shed stood about 30 feet to the right, mostly surrounded by trees. No neighbors in sight, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. Inside, it was simple but decent. A main room with a bed, small table, and a wood stove. A kitchen space with a propane-powered fridge and stove. A tiny bathroom in the back with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower system. There were a few canned goods in the cupboard and some old pots and pans. The floor creaked a bit when I walked, but the place felt solid. That first night was peaceful. I made some scrambled eggs and toast, read a paperback I'd brought, and went to bed early. The silence was strange at first. I kept expecting to hear something mechanical. A car, a plane overhead, but there was nothing. Just wind, owls, and the occasional creak of wood expanding and settling. The second day, I took a hike around the area. There was a faint trail leading north from the cabin, probably used by hunters or previous renters. I followed it for maybe 2 hours, just letting myself breathe and not think about anything. I saw deer tracks, some squirrel nests, even a rusted-out truck half buried in leaves and dirt. The forest felt old. Not wild exactly, but untouched, like it had grown without people for a long time. When I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed something weird. The rocking chair on the porch was angled differently than I remembered. I hadn't touched it since arriving, but it was now facing outward, toward the trees. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wind had shifted it. It wasn't even that strong of a breeze, but I didn't think much of it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. There was a constant rustling outside, more than usual. I chalked it up to raccoons or maybe a bear passing through. I'd seen no signs of human activity nearby, so I figured animals were more comfortable wandering close. Still, it was enough to keep me awake for a while. I finally drifted off after midnight. The third day started fine. I made coffee using a small camp kettle and sat on the porch. I tried reading, but I kept glancing at the trees. Felt like something was off. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to check out the shed, which I hadn't opened yet. The door creaked badly, and the hinges were rusted. Inside were some old tools, an axe, a broken chainsaw, rusted nails, and a few lengths of rotted rope. There was a strong smell of mildew. I saw what looked like an old mattress folded against the wall. It had yellow stains and a ripped corner. I stepped closer and noticed scratch marks on the inside of the shed door. Long, thin gouges, not deep, but there were a lot of them. My stomach turned a bit. I stepped out and shut the door. That night was worse than the last. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not animal movements, clear, deliberate footsteps. Soft, slow, like someone walking barefoot. My blood ran cold. I froze in bed and didn't move. The steps circled the cabin once. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I went outside and looked around. No tracks. The ground was dry, covered in leaves. I checked the area around the porch, then walked toward the shed. The door was closed, same as I'd left it. I opened it anyway. Nothing had changed. Still, I felt like I was being watched. The trees felt closer than before, like they were pressing in. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe I was just on edge from being alone. I tried to shake it off. I kept my hatchet nearby, though, just in case. That evening, I cooked early, cleaned up, and sat on the porch until it got dark. I didn't hear anything unusual, but the unease never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, into the trees. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in once the sun dipped below the ridge. I brought the generator inside that night and locked the door. I didn't want to go outside in the dark. I didn't even use the lights much, just one solar lantern by the bed. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything at first, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. Then I heard a tap on the window, just once. Then again, a slow, steady tap. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. The window didn't have curtains, just an old sheet tacked over it. I stayed still, clutching the hatchet. The tapping stopped. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch. That same slow step, one at a time. Felt like someone was checking the place, circling again. After maybe 10 minutes, everything stopped. I waited another hour before I dared to move. The first light, I went outside. Again, no tracks, but the rocking chair had moved again. Now it was facing the window. I stared at it for a long time, then turned and went back in. I packed up my stuff in silence. I was done. I didn't even eat breakfast. I didn't clean up. I just threw everything in the back of the truck, started the engine, and left. I didn't look back once. The road out felt longer than before. Every tree felt like it was hiding something. Every shadow made me flinch. Back in Erie, I told people I cut my vacation short because I got bored. That wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. I didn't tell anyone about the footsteps or the tapping or the rocking chair. I didn't even write a review for the rental site. I just deleted the confirmation email and tried to forget about the whole thing. 2 weeks later, I was watching the local news when I saw a segment about a missing person. A hiker named Mark Powell, age 29, had disappeared in the Allegheny forest. Last seen near the northern edge of the park, right near where that cabin was. The report said his campsite had been found abandoned, but no signs of struggle. Just vanished. They showed a photo of him. He looked like any guy you'd see in a coffee shop. Smiling, normal. I stared at the photo for a long time. Not because I recognized him, I didn't. but because something about his eyes felt familiar. Not his actual eyes, but the look, like he'd seen something out there too. I didn't sleep much that night. I haven't been back into the woods since. I still think about that cabin sometimes. The rocking chair, the tapping, the shed. I don't know if someone was living out there, watching people who rented the place, or if I was just the lucky one who left before something worse happened. I don't really need an answer. I just know I got out, and that's enough for me. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the Northwoods of Minnesota. I was 29 years old, burned out from the city's noise and stress. I needed silence and space to clear my mind, away from phones, people, and responsibilities. The cabin was a modest wooden structure on the edge of a dense pine forest, about 2 miles from the nearest road. I had never been out there before, but I found it listed in a small magazine for rustic cabins available for rent. The owner was an older man who only accepted cash and gave vague directions over the phone. That was enough for me. I arrived late afternoon, carrying my backpack and a small box of supplies. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough and narrow, the tires crunching on gravel and dry twigs. As I walked up to the cabin, the sun was already starting to lower behind the trees, casting long shadows. The air smelled of pine and earth, mixed with a faint scent of smoke from some distant campfire. The cabin looked weathered but solid. The wooden boards were faded to a dull gray, and the windows were dirty but intact. A small porch with 2 creaky rocking chairs faced the forest. Inside, the cabin was bare but comfortable. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a rough wooden table and chairs, and a small bed covered with a thick quilt. There was no electricity, but a small box of matches and some oil lamps sat on a shelf. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly by the back door. I unpacked my food and supplies on the table and lit a lamp. The soft, flickering light filled the room with a warm glow. The first night was quiet, except for the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the faint crackle of branches under the feet of some unseen animal. I sat by the stove, reading an old paperback I'd brought, the fire giving off a steady warmth. Outside, the darkness felt thick and alive, but inside, I felt safe. On the second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense with tall pine and fir trees. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with pine needles and moss. I found a small stream about a quarter-mile away, its water clear and cold, running over smooth stones. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, warming patches of the forest floor. I stayed there for hours, watching dragonflies hover above the water and listening to the gentle babble of the stream. That night, I built a fire outside the cabin. The flames licked at the dry wood, throwing sparks up into the sky. I roasted some canned beans and bread on a stick, the smell mixing with the pine smoke. The sky was clear, and stars filled the black dome above. I lay back on the rough wooden porch, feeling the night air cool against my skin, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. But things started to change on the third day. I woke early before dawn. The cabin was cold, the wind rattling the loose boards. I made a fire in the stove, letting it burn for warmth. Outside, the forest looked different, more silent. The birds were quiet, and even the usual rustling seemed to stop. I shrugged it off as just the natural stillness of the early morning and headed out to refill my water bottle at the stream. As I walked through the forest, I noticed something strange. The ground near the cabin had faint footprints, heavy, booted prints, leading from the road toward the cabin. They were fresh, no older than a day. That worried me a bit because the cabin was supposed to be completely isolated. Who else was out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I decided to stay alert but didn't want to panic. Maybe a hunter or someone else was camping nearby. I looked around carefully but didn't see or hear anyone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest felt too still, like it was holding its breath. When night came, I stayed inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. On the fourth day, I noticed more signs. Broken branches near the edge of the clearing. A discarded soda can lying half buried in the dirt. Someone had definitely been close. I didn't want to confront whoever it was, so I stayed inside most of the day, pacing and thinking. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that I had called a friend in the city before I left and left the address of the cabin with them. If anything went wrong, someone would come looking. That afternoon, I went outside briefly to chop some wood for the stove. The sun was warm, but the air was sharp and cool. While stacking the wood, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. I stopped and stared, but there was nothing there. I finished quickly and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt smaller, more confining. The fifth day was worse. I heard noises at night, footsteps crunching around the cabin, maybe even the sound of someone breathing outside the window. The cabin's walls felt thin, and I could almost hear whispers carried on the wind, but I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. I stopped going out except when I had to. The isolation that was so peaceful at first became a trap. I started feeling trapped and panicked. The forest, once beautiful, now seemed hostile and dark. Then, on the morning of the sixth day, I woke to find the back door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. Panic hit me hard. Someone had been inside the cabin. My heart pounded as I checked every corner. Nothing was missing, but I felt violated, watched, and vulnerable. I decided then to leave the next morning. That night, I barely slept, sitting up by the stove with an axe close at hand. In the early hours of the seventh day, just as the sky began to lighten, I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I locked the cabin, grabbed my backpack, and started walking back down the dirt road toward my car. As I walked, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt. They were too wide for a normal car, maybe a pickup truck or an ATV. I followed them for a while, the forest still and quiet. Suddenly, I heard voices in the distance. Men talking in low, harsh tones. I ducked behind a tree and saw a group of men unloading crates from a large truck. They didn't see me. The crates were heavy and marked with strange symbols, not ones I recognized. The men looked tough, rough, and armed. I realized I had stumbled onto something illegal, maybe poachers or smugglers using the forest as a hideout. My heart raced. I turned and ran back toward the road, faster than I had ever run. I didn't stop until I reached my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced back and saw the men gathering around a fire, watching the road. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I told the friend I had left my address with everything I saw. We contacted the local sheriff's department, but by the time they investigated, the men and their operation were gone. The forest returned to silence, but I knew what was hidden beneath its calm surface. That trip taught me how thin the line is between peace and danger, and how even in the quietest, most remote places, people carry their secrets, some darker than the shadows of the trees. I learned to trust my instincts and that sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. It was the summer of 1997 when I first decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I was 29 at the time, tired of the noise and stress of city life in Boston. The idea of escaping to a small, rustic cabin without any internet or phone reception sounded perfect. A chance to clear my head, get some rest, and reconnect with nature. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, built in the 1940s by some old family friend who had long since passed away, but it was sturdy with basic electricity and running water. I arrived on a quiet Monday afternoon. The weather was warm but not hot, the sun shining through tall pines and birches. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was rough and narrow, surrounded by thick forest on both sides. I remember the silence pressing in around me as I parked my old Subaru in the small clearing next to the cabin. There was no cell phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was a simple wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and two small windows on the front. Inside, The air smelled of old wood and a faint hint of mothballs. The floor creaked underfoot, and the furniture was sparse but functional. A worn sofa, a small wooden table, a bed with a faded quilt, and a wood stove. I set my bags down, unpacked a few things, and opened the windows to let fresh air in. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird or crow. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping firewood, exploring the nearby trails, and reading old paperbacks I had brought with me. Mornings were filled with the sharp, clean smell of dew and pine, and evenings fell early, casting long shadows through the trees. I enjoyed cooking simple meals on the small stove: beans, rice, canned vegetables, and fresh trout I caught from a nearby stream. The nights were cool, and I wrapped myself tightly in blankets, falling asleep to the steady crackle of the fire. But on the fourth day, something started to feel off. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., to the sound of twigs snapping outside. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush, but the sound was too deliberate and too close. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. The rustling continued, slow footsteps pacing back and forth just beyond the cabin's porch. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the thick trees. Nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no shape moving in the shadows. The sun was starting to rise, and the forest lightened to a dull gray-green. I told myself it was probably a stray dog or a hunter passing by, but something didn't sit right. The air felt heavier, and the silence that followed was almost too complete, like the forest was holding its breath. That afternoon, while gathering water from the stream, I noticed strange marks on the ground near the cabin. Footprints, but not quite human. The prints were larger than mine and deeper, almost as if someone was stomping heavily. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared where the underbrush grew thick. I had no idea who could be out there, and why they would be so close to the cabin without making themselves known. By the fifth day, unease settled into a dull ache in my chest. I kept hearing noises at odd times. Distant knocking on the cabin walls, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot when I expected none, the sound of breathing in the woods late at night. The forest around the cabin felt less like a peaceful refuge and more like a trap. One night, just past midnight, I woke suddenly to a sharp banging on the front door. My heart hammered as I stared into the darkness. No footsteps followed, no voice called out, just that heavy knocking. I didn't dare open the door. I stayed frozen, clutching a small hunting knife I'd brought along, waiting for the sound to stop. It did, after a minute or two, leaving an echoing silence that seemed even louder. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat awake until dawn, watching the windows and listening for anything unusual. The next morning, I found something on the porch, an old, rusty key tied to a scrap of cloth. No note, no sign of who left it or why. I didn't recognize it from anywhere. It felt like a warning or a message meant to unsettle me. I spent the next day packing a small bag. My plan was to leave early the next morning. But as evening came, the noises grew louder and closer. Scratches on the walls, soft thuds from the attic above, and again, footsteps circling the cabin like a predator stalking prey. I sat by the fire, my back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, trying to keep my shaking hands steady. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the windows. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Something heavy had been thrown against the back wall. I jumped up, grabbing my knife and flashlight, heart racing. I crept to the back door and looked outside. Nothing but shadows and trees. But I noticed something else. Someone had been there, right outside the window. Smears of dirt on the glass, and what looked like a muddy footprint on the porch step. Fear swallowed me whole. I debated whether to stay or leave. The road was rough and steep, and the night was falling fast. But I couldn't stay and wait to find out what was lurking outside. Just as I was about to grab my bag and leave, I heard the soft sound of breathing very close behind me. I spun around, knife raised, but no one was there. My pulse thundered in my ears. I grabbed the bag, threw on my jacket, and ran out the door, down the porch steps, and into the dark forest. I didn't stop running. Branches slapped against my face and arms. Roots tripped me up, but I pushed forward. I knew the road was about a half-mile away, but the woods seemed endless in the dark. I tripped once and fell hard on my knees, scraping my palms and bleeding. But I got up and kept going. I could hear footsteps behind me, faster now, closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps. I thought about calling for help, but knew no one was around to hear me. The only thing I could do was keep moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto the gravel road. The moon had broken through the clouds, and I could see my car a short distance away. I ran toward it, fumbling with my keys, hands trembling so badly I dropped them twice. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark like blades. I drove away without looking back. As I hit the paved highway and turned on the radio, relief flooded over me. The normal sounds of traffic and voices felt like a shield against the darkness I'd left behind. The next day, I reported the strange happenings to the local sheriff's office. They said no one else had reported anything unusual, but they promised to check the area. Later, I learned from a neighbor that someone had been living illegally in the woods nearby. A man with a history of violence who had escaped from prison years before and was never caught. I never went back to that cabin again. The experience left a mark on me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting. Now, years later, I still think about that week, how the peaceful woods I longed for turned into a place of fear. But I'm grateful I got out alive, that I trusted my instincts to run, even when I didn't know what was chasing me. I keep the rusty key on a chain around my neck now, a reminder of how close I came to danger, and how important it is to listen to the quiet warnings the world sometimes gives us. I rented the cabin in late October of 2022, just outside of Marquette, Michigan. I was 33 years old, single, and trying to get away from a stressful job in Grand Rapids. I worked in IT, mostly remote, but burnout had hit me hard that year. I needed to unplug, get away from people, and just sit in silence. I'd been looking at cabins on rental sites for a while, and this one caught my eye because it looked remote and simple. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just a wood stove, a generator, and trees in every direction. It was a single-room wooden place with a loft for sleeping, maybe half a mile off a small dirt road. The guy who owned it was an older man named Harold. We only talked through email. He gave me directions, told me how to start the generator if I needed power, and where the key would be, under the flat rock next to the front steps. It was cold when I got there, mid-30s. The wind kept moving through the trees and the whole forest felt like it was breathing. The road that led to the cabin wasn't really a road, just a pair of muddy tire tracks through tall grass and brush. I drove my old Subaru in as far as I could before the trees narrowed in and I had to stop and walk the rest. I parked it maybe a 5-minute walk from the cabin and carried my bag and food cooler in 2 trips. No cell signal, which I expected. I left my phone in the car and told myself that was the point of all this, to disconnect. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. The wood was old, cracked in places, but it held the heat well enough. I didn't even need the generator the first night. The wood stove worked great. I sat in a chair by the front window, watching the trees go dark while the fire snapped behind me. I had brought a couple of books and a journal. I didn't plan on doing much but reading, sleeping, and maybe taking walks during the day. I fell asleep early that first night, and I remember waking up around 3 a.m. because the wind had really picked up. It made the whole cabin creak. I lay there listening to it and thinking how quiet the rest of the world felt without the hum of a fridge or the glow of a screen. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring. The second day was just as quiet. I walked maybe a mile into the woods behind the cabin, following a deer trail. The land rolled gently, with lots of mossy rocks and birch trees. I didn't see another person or any signs of one. That night, I used the generator for a while so I could boil water for a real meal and run the light overhead. The quiet stillness was starting to feel a little thick by then. I had this moment sitting at the small table where I thought I heard something out beyond the trees, a sound that didn't quite fit. It was like a dry stick breaking, fast like a step. But I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer. There were signs of them everywhere, even close to the cabin. I finished eating, killed the generator, and went to bed early again. That third day is when things started to feel off. I woke up early and found that something had knocked over the trash bin I'd left outside. I'd kept it sealed and latched, but it was on its side, lit off, some wrappers and food scraps scattered. At first, I thought it was a raccoon, maybe a black bear. But the prints in the dirt weren't paws. They were boot prints. I stood there staring at them for a long time. There were two, one pressed into the mud near the bin, another a little farther off, but the pattern was clear. Treaded sole, left foot, no other signs around it. No drag marks or heel print nearby, almost like someone had stepped into the mud once and vanished. I tried to reason through it. Maybe a hiker passed through and I hadn't noticed. Maybe the trash bin fell on its own, and the boot print was mine from yesterday, and I just didn't remember. I tried to fit it into something normal because that's how we keep going when things start to wobble. I picked everything up, cleaned off the food scraps, and moved the bin inside the cabin. That night, I didn't use the generator. I didn't want to be lit up like a beacon. I sat in the dark with only the wood stove light and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every time a gust of wind shook the trees, I froze a little. I started thinking about how far I was from the nearest house or phone. There was no way to call anyone. My car was half a mile back down the trail. If something happened out here, I'd be on my own. That kind of isolation starts to feel like pressure. It builds behind your ears, and suddenly everything is too quiet, too sharp. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking I heard someone moving around outside, but every time I went to the window, I couldn't see anything. The moon was bright, which helped, but it also made shadows that looked like people. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted off. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the firewood I'd stacked neatly by the door was scattered. Not like it had fallen, like it had been tossed around. Some pieces were way out in the yard, too far to have just rolled. Again, no paw prints, just two more boot prints, spaced far apart, facing the door. I walked a wide circle around the cabin that morning, looking for signs of anyone. Nothing. No campsites, no old gear, no trail markers, just the woods. It didn't make sense. If someone was out here, where were they staying? And why mess with me without making contact? It didn't feel random. I started locking the door even during the day, even though it barely mattered, just an old deadbolt and thin walls. I took the firewood inside and moved my cooler in too. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the loft with the lights off, just watching the yard. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe to catch someone in the act, maybe to convince myself I was imagining it. But around 2:30 a.m., I saw movement. A figure came out from the trees to the left, just at the edge of the yard. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing something dark. It didn't run or sneak. It just stood there. I watched it from the loft, holding my breath, hoping it couldn't see me. It moved slowly toward the cabin. I could hear the leaves under its boots. When it got maybe 10 feet from the porch, it stopped. It stood there for what felt like forever. Then it backed away, step by step, and vanished into the trees. I didn't move until the sun came up. I packed that morning. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Just walk out and hope the person wasn't waiting? I stuffed everything into my bag, grabbed my cooler, and left. The walk to the car was tense. Every few steps I'd stop and listen. The forest felt different, still and watching. I made it to my car and threw everything in the back. As I went to close the hatch, I saw something in the dirt behind my tires. More boot prints, fresh, deep, like someone had been standing there watching the car. I drove out of there as fast as I could. The Subaru bounced down the trail, scraping branches, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I got to a diner outside of Ishpeming, sat in the parking lot, and just stared at nothing for a while. My phone had service again, so I turned it on. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even know what to say. I emailed Harold that night and told him something had happened, that I left early. He didn't respond. I didn't follow up. A week later, back in Grand Rapids, I started searching online for anything I could find about that area. No news, no reports, nothing. I looked up missing persons cases, just in case, but there was nothing nearby that matched. I looked up Harold's email domain, tried to see if the listing was still up. It wasn't. His name brought up no results. No cabin rentals, no local business listings. It was like he disappeared. I never told anyone the full story, not until now. And to this day, I don't know what the person out there wanted. They never tried to break in. They never left a note or made a sound. They just let me know they were there over and over without a word. What I do know is this: whoever it was had been watching me since I arrived. The boot prints weren't just random. They were placed, like they wanted to make sure I saw them. The trash, the firewood, the standing outside the cabin, it was all intentional. It wasn't someone lost or curious. It was someone playing a game. I haven't gone back to the woods since. Even now, if I walk in a park and hear a stick break behind me, I tense up. I look over my shoulder more than I used to. It's not paranoia, it's memory. Because once you know what it feels like to be watched by someone who never speaks, never shows themselves fully, and never leaves proof, they don't need to follow you. You carry them with you. And the scariest part is, whoever they were, they didn't want to hurt me. Not directly. They wanted me to leave. And I did. But what if I hadn't? That's the part that keeps me awake. Not what happened, but what didn't. What might have. What they were waiting for. I was 34 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. It was October 2022, right after a stressful contract ended at work, and I felt like I needed to reset. I booked the place online after reading a few decent reviews. It was a simple off-grid cabin, about 15 miles from the nearest town, with no electricity or running water, and only a small wood stove for heat. That was the appeal. No internet, no noise, no people, just trees and silence. The road leading to the cabin was more like a dirt trail after the last few houses dropped off. My old SUV made it most of the way, but I had to park half a mile out and walk the rest because the final stretch was too muddy and overgrown. I had packed light but brought enough food, water jugs, and gear to last 5 days. My cell phone had no signal once I got into the hills, which I expected. I had an emergency radio with GPS just in case something went really wrong. The cabin itself was even more basic than I imagined. It was built from dark, weathered wood and only had one room with a narrow cot, a small table and a few shelves. There was an outhouse about 20 yards behind it and a fire pit out front. The woods were dense all around, not a single clear view beyond maybe 20 feet in any direction. Still, the place was dry, quiet, and everything worked as advertised. The first 2 days were uneventful. I went on short hikes during daylight, cooked simple meals, read some paperback novels by lantern light, and spent time just listening to the wind in the trees. It was cool but not freezing, though I needed to feed the wood stove regularly to keep the cabin from getting too cold at night. There was a strange comfort in the solitude. I felt like I was finally starting to relax, like I was resetting my mind the way I hoped to. Things started to feel a little off on the third day, early in the morning. I woke up around 6 a.m. It was still dark, and I heard the steady sound outside, something crunching the leaves. It wasn't constant, more like short bursts of movement, then long pauses. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe a fox. I stayed still and just listened. After a while, the noise stopped, and I went back to sleep. Later that day, I took my usual walk down the trail that looped behind the cabin. The air was colder, and a thin fog had settled in through the trees. About a quarter mile into the walk, I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks, maybe 6 or 7, stacked in a little cone, was sitting in the middle of the trail. It looked out of place, too neat, too recent. I had walked that same trail the day before, and it definitely hadn't been there. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Could have been someone else hiking the trail earlier and playing around. Still, I didn't like how silent everything felt. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of my boots on the damp trail. I turned around earlier than usual and went back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small noise outside made me flinch. The wind scraped tree branches against the walls, and every now and then, I'd hear what sounded like quick footsteps crunching leaves and then nothing. I kept getting up to check through the small window, but it was just blackness outside. No lights, no shapes, just trees. I stayed bundled in my sleeping bag on the cot with my flashlight in my hand, trying to stay calm. When the sun finally rose, I felt relief, like I'd been holding my breath all night. I got dressed, stepped outside to clear my head, and immediately noticed something else. There were small indentations in the mud near the fire pit. Not animal prints, boot prints, human, and not mine. They were smaller than my size 11s, and they came from the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. Some were half erased by rain, but they were fresh. No doubt about it. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, maybe a hunter or a bored local. But I hadn't seen or heard another person since I arrived, and the nearest house was miles away. I walked the edge of the woods, trying to follow where the tracks went, but they vanished quickly on the drier ground. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I packed my bag and debated leaving right then, but the idea of hiking out through the fog, down the muddy trail, and then driving 15 miles back to the main road didn't sit right either. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just to see if anything else happened. If it did, I'd leave at first light. I made sure the cabin was secure that night. I blocked the door with a heavy chair, kept my flashlight and the emergency GPS close, and didn't light the fire so there wouldn't be any glow through the cracks in the wall. I even stayed dressed just in case I had to run. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. Soft, slow, not crunching leaves like before, but stepping on the porch boards. They were right outside. I didn't move. My flashlight was off. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped right at the door. For what felt like minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard the faint sound of the doorknob moving. Not violently, just testing it. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. They had to. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would echo through the walls. Then, after a few moments, the footsteps moved again. Slowly, back down the steps. Then silence. I stayed frozen in bed until sunrise. When it got light enough to see, I finally opened the door. There were boot prints in the frost on the porch. Same size as before. They stopped at the door and then turned back toward the trees. That was it. No signs of damage or anything left behind. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything into it, and left within 15 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't check the outhouse or the trail. I didn't look back. I walked fast through the woods, slipping in the mud, branches hitting my arms, until I reached my SUV. It was untouched, but I still felt like I was being watched the whole time. I drove until I had cell service, then stopped in a gas station parking lot to breathe. I never reported anything. What would I even say? There was no crime, no real evidence, just footsteps and a sense of something being wrong. I checked the reviews again for that cabin weeks later. The listing was gone. No trace of it online anymore. I still don't know if someone else rented it after me or if the owner pulled it down for some reason. It's been over a year now, and I still think about those nights. About the footsteps, the quiet testing of the door, the deliberate way they circled the cabin. It wasn't random. Someone was watching me, waiting. I don't know for what. I haven't gone camping since. I won't again. I spent the first week of September 2019 alone in a cabin near Thompson Pass in Alaska. I was 31 at the time, burned out from work, and needing space from people. I didn't grow up camping or anything like that, but I'd read enough about solitude helping mental clarity, and I figured it couldn't hurt to unplug for a bit. My plan was simple. Stay in a rented cabin for 7 days. No phone, no internet, just some books, a notebook, and my thoughts. The cabin was old, but it had been refurbished recently by a local guy who listed it online as off-grid and ideal for thinkers. It sat on the edge of some thick pine woods about a 40-minute drive from the nearest store in Valdez. I drove up from Anchorage in a rented Subaru and got to the cabin late in the afternoon. The road that led to it turned from gravel into a rutted dirt track halfway through, winding between trees until it ended in a sort of clearing just big enough to park. The cabin itself was maybe 20 by 20 feet, made from weathered timber, with a tiny front porch, a slanted roof, and a tall metal chimney poking out the side. There was a generator out back, a small shed off to the left, and a beat-up woodpile stacked against the wall. Inside was sparse but comfortable. A small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with thick blankets, and a counter with some dishes and a propane stove. The man who owned it had stocked it with a few canned goods and left a large jug of drinking water. There was no running water, just a bucket and ladle system with a barrel that collected rain off the roof. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet away, just past the shed. The first day went by quietly. I unpacked my food, mostly trail mix, rice and soup, and made a pot of instant coffee. I spent the evening sitting on the porch watching the sun fall behind the tree line. The cold came quickly after dark, and I lit the stove and stayed close to it while I read. At night, I could hear wind moving through the trees, and once or twice I thought I heard distant snapping branches, but I chalked it up to animals. That first night, I fell asleep fast. The second day, I walked around the area, not far, just exploring maybe a half-mile radius around the cabin. There wasn't a trail, just thick forest and undergrowth. The ground was uneven and soft in some places, like it held too much water. I saw a few squirrel nests, some rabbit prints, and once spotted a black shape I think was a moose further out. No people, though. No other cabins. I was completely alone. That was the point. By the third day, I'd settled into a routine. Wake up, boil water, write in the notebook for a few hours, eat, take a walk, chop some wood, then read or just sit around until bed. I started to notice how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring after a while. No distant cars, no hum from electronics, no people talking. Just wind, the occasional bird, and whatever small things moved through the woods. That night, I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard something that wasn't the wind. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching across the gravel by the side of the cabin. I held my breath and listened. After maybe 20 seconds, it stopped. I waited another few minutes, then got up, moved to the window and looked out. I didn't see anything. Could have been an animal. Could have been the trees shifting. But something about the rhythm of the sound felt off. Too steady. I didn't sleep well after that. I kept one of the axes by the bed, just in case. When morning came, I checked around the cabin and didn't see anything unusual. No prints in the dirt. No signs of tampering. I told myself it had to be my imagination, or maybe a bear. On day 4, I noticed something strange. I had a small stack of firewood next to the door, maybe 6 or 7 pieces, and when I stepped out in the morning, one of them was gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd burned more the night before than I remembered, but I was sure I hadn't touched that stack. It wasn't like the wind could have blown it away either. I searched around but didn't find it nearby. Just gone. Later that day, I went to the shed to get more wood. The lock was still in place, but the inside looked like someone had rummaged through it. An old tarp was pulled off the shelf, and a bundle of rope that had been coiled was now loose and lying on the floor. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. There wasn't any reason for it to look like that unless someone had been in there. But the shed was locked, and the only key was in my pocket. I was starting to feel it then, that crawling unease, like something was watching me just beyond the trees. I didn't go on my afternoon walk that day. I stayed close to the cabin, checking and rechecking the locks, going in and out of the door to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I stacked more firewood inside and locked the door earlier than usual. That night, I barely slept. Every sound felt loud. Every creak in the wood made me grip the axe a little tighter. On the morning of day 5, I found prints. Not animal ones, boot prints. They were faint, like someone had walked across the soft dirt maybe the day before. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the trees. I followed them for about 30 feet before the ground got too firm to keep track. I couldn't tell which direction the person came from or where they went, but someone had definitely been there. I didn't know what to do. I had no phone, no radio, no way to call anyone. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away, and even if I tried to drive back, I wasn't sure I could find the road in the dark if I needed to leave fast. I kept the axe close and stayed alert. I checked the windows constantly. Every time I stepped outside to get wood or go to the outhouse, I felt exposed. That afternoon, I decided to write everything down, just in case. I listed the missing firewood, the shed being disturbed, the footprints, the footsteps at night. I left the page open on the table. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped whoever was out there would see it and leave me alone. Or maybe it was for someone else to find if things went badly. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the stove, axe across my lap, wrapped in a blanket. Around 2 a.m, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving outside along the wall. This time they didn't stop. They circled the cabin once, then again. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. After maybe 10 minutes, everything went quiet. Then I heard the shed door creak open. The lock had still been on earlier that day. I was sure of it. I checked. I sat frozen, listening. No other sounds. Just that one long creak, then silence. I stayed in the chair until the sky started to turn gray. When it was light enough to see, I went outside with the axe in hand. The shed door was wide open. The lock was on the ground, broken. Inside, more things were scattered. The rope was missing. So was the small hatchet I'd left on the shelf. I felt sick. Someone had broken in during the night while I was just feet away. I looked around for more prints, and this time I found them clear as day. Boot prints leading away from the shed and toward the woods behind the cabin. I followed them. They didn't go far. Maybe 50 yards in, I found something that stopped me cold. A lean-to made of branches and bark. Roughly built, maybe 6 feet long, and covered in moss like it had been camouflaged. Inside were scraps of food wrappers, a plastic water bottle, and a shredded sleeping bag. Whoever had been near the cabin had been staying out there. I didn't go further. I turned around and walked fast back to the cabin. I threw everything into my backpack: food, water, my notebook, and got in the car. I didn't look back. I drove fast, bouncing over the dirt track until I found the gravel road again, then kept going until I reached the main highway. I didn't stop until I got to Valdez. I booked a room at a motel and stayed there for the night. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell the guy who rented me the cabin. I just wanted to leave it all behind. I drove back to Anchorage the next day and flew home. I think about that week more than I want to. I still wonder who that person was, what they were doing out there, why they came so close to the cabin without ever making themselves known. They didn't try to break in. They didn't leave any messages. Just watched, took things, circled. Could have been worse. I tell myself that often. Maybe they were just someone living off-grid, keeping to themselves, and I happened to get too close. Maybe they were testing me, or maybe they were waiting to see how I'd react. What I do know is this: I'll never go back to a cabin alone again. There are things in the woods that aren't ghosts or monsters, just people, and sometimes that's worse. It was the middle of October 2022 when I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working in a small logistics office in Fort Wayne, Indiana, handling warehouse reports and late truck deliveries for the last 6 years, and I was burnt out. I was 33, single, and just exhausted from staring at monitors and tracking shipments. My eyes hurt. My back was always stiff. The job wasn't hard, but it never let up. I just needed some quiet, some time where I didn't have to answer emails or take calls or fix problems for anyone else. I'd been to Michigan's Upper Peninsula before, and I remembered how remote it felt. Endless trees, winding dirt roads, and that heavy silence you can only get far from other people. I looked around online and found a small rental cabin about 35 minutes north of Manistee, deep in the woods, past the main highway. It wasn't fancy. No Wi-Fi, no TV. Just a little wooden place with a tin roof, a propane stove, a wood stove for heat, and an outhouse a few yards out back. It was exactly what I was looking for, somewhere to shut out the world for a while. I left early on a Wednesday morning, just as the sun was coming up, and drove through Indiana and the lower part of Michigan until I crossed the Mackinac Bridge. By the time I got to Manistee, it was almost 4 p.m. I stopped at a small grocery store and picked up some basic supplies: cans of chili, beef stew, instant coffee, bread, peanut butter, a few gallons of water. I also grabbed a pack of wood matches, some batteries, and a box of granola bars. After that, I followed the emailed directions the owner gave me and headed north. The road turned to gravel after 15 minutes. Then, 10 miles later, it turned to dirt. The trees closed in, tall and thin and packed together, mostly birch and pine, and the land started to slope a little as I went further in. No other cars, no cell signal, just my old Ford Focus bouncing slowly over ruts, inching along at maybe 15 miles per hour. I passed a couple of hunting cabins, but they looked empty. Windows boarded up, no vehicles, no lights. Finally, I found the cabin I'd rented. It sat on a slight rise, surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest, with a small clearing in the back that led to a shallow ravine. A narrow path led to a metal shed and an outhouse behind it. I parked, stretched my legs, and looked around. The place was smaller than I expected, maybe 25 feet wide, with a metal chimney sticking out the roof and a wooden porch that sagged slightly on one side. A pile of firewood was stacked beside the front steps. I unlocked the door with the key I'd been mailed, stepped inside, and just stood there for a while. It smelled like pine and old dust. There was a small kitchen to the left with a propane stove, a sink that only worked if you pumped the handle to draw from the rain barrel, and a counter covered in faded linoleum. To the right, a narrow door led to a bedroom just big enough for a twin mattress and a metal frame bed. There was also a fold-out couch, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner with a steel bucket for ash, and a few cracked windows with cheap curtains that hung stiff and crooked. It wasn't cozy, not exactly, but it felt like somewhere people didn't go very often, which was what I wanted. I brought in my stuff, unpacked, and lit the stove. It took a while to get the flame going, but I eventually had a little warmth. I made some coffee, ate a granola bar, and sat outside on the porch until it got dark. That first night was calm. It got colder than I expected, down to about 35 degrees, and I had to keep feeding the wood stove until midnight just to keep the cabin livable. I kept my socks on in the sleeping bag and used 2 blankets. I heard coyotes howling sometime after 2 a.m. and an owl close by, but nothing unusual. Just the sounds of the woods. The next 2 days were mostly the same. I walked a bit, sat outside, drank coffee, wrote in my notebook, read an old paperback I brought with me. I didn't see another human being. I didn't hear a car. The quiet started to get into my head a little, but I liked it. Time slowed down. My breathing got deeper. I stopped checking my phone, even though I knew I couldn't get a signal. The stress I'd carried for months started to loosen. But something changed on the 4th day. That morning, I woke up early and went outside to use the outhouse. The air was heavy, cold and wet, like it had rained a little overnight. There were more clouds than usual. I walked around the back of the cabin to grab another bundle of firewood, and I noticed something weird. The shed door, which had been shut tight since I arrived, was now open about 6 inches. It was a rusted metal door, and it made a loud squeal when moved, so I would have heard it during the night. I hadn't. I walked over and looked inside. It was just a storage shed with some broken tools, a rusted snow shovel, and a couple of paint cans. Nothing looked disturbed, but the door still bothered me. There hadn't been any wind. I closed it again, pulled hard until I heard it click, and went back inside. Around noon, I took a walk down the path behind the cabin. It curved through the woods for a 1/4 mile before sloping down into a gully full of moss and broken trees. I noticed something about 50 feet off the trail, a short tree stump that looked recently cut. But when I got closer, I saw it wasn't a tree at all. It was a piece of wood driven into the ground with a rough top, like it had been used as a post. Around it were marks in the dirt, half-circle indents like someone had stood there, turning in place. I looked around. I didn't see anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random. It looked like something someone had made or used. Not for firewood, not for camping, something else. That night, I kept the fire going longer and double-checked the lock on the door before I went to bed. I lay there, listening to the wind in the trees, and tried to tell myself it was nothing. Probably a hunter, I thought. Someone who'd used the woods long before I showed up. But the next morning, something was different again. There were boot prints outside the cabin. Not my own. These were wider, heavier. They came from the woods on the east side of the clearing, near the base of the hill, and led straight to the front porch. They stopped at the steps, turned slightly, and then went around the side toward the shed. There was no sign of them returning to the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The soil was damp from the night before, and the prints were clear, deep enough to show weight, tread marks that looked like work boots. I followed them slowly, heart thumping harder than it should have. When I got to the back corner of the cabin, I saw that the prints had circled the building completely, once, then disappeared back into the trees. I didn't know what to do. There was no phone signal, no one nearby, and I hadn't seen a car in days. I stood on the porch for a long time, just looking out into the trees, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was someone from a nearby cabin. Maybe it was old, but I knew it wasn't. The earth was soft. It had rained. These were from last night. That whole day I felt watched. Every time I stepped outside, I looked over my shoulder. Every noise felt sharper. A branch snapped behind the outhouse around noon, and I spun so fast I dropped the wood I was carrying. Nothing was there. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going until I ran out of wood. I sat in the chair by the window with a flashlight and a kitchen knife on my lap, even though I knew how stupid that was. My ears were ringing with silence. I kept thinking I saw movement past the trees, but it was always just wind or shadows. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a slow, dragging step across the porch. Then another. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I felt sick. I clicked off the flashlight and leaned down under the window, pressing my back to the wall. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the wood creak again. Then the faint tap of something brushing against the front door. Not knocking, just touching it. I didn't breathe. I sat there for what felt like hours. I heard another creak, then nothing. No footsteps walking away, no voices, just the fire crackling low and slow. When the sun finally rose, I crept to the door and looked outside. There was nothing there, but the boot prints were back. This time they led to the door and stopped. No prints led away. I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag, tossed everything into the car without eating, and drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. My tires skidded a couple times on the loose gravel, but I didn't care. I just needed to be out of those woods. I made it back to Manistee by noon and pulled into a gas station, shaking. I sat there for 10 minutes before I could move again. When I finally checked my phone, I had over 60 missed notifications. Emails, work messages, news alerts. I didn't answer any of them. I drove back to Fort Wayne that night, through the dark with the radio off. My hands never stopped gripping the wheel. I never found out who it was. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin and left footprints? But I know what I felt. I know how real it was. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I was 34 that summer, and I'd just gotten through a divorce that left me more tired than angry. I was living in Bend, Oregon, renting a small duplex and working remotely as a data analyst for a company based out of Denver. The work was repetitive and quiet, perfect for someone who didn't want to talk much. After months of emails, spreadsheets, and frozen dinners, I figured I could use a change of scenery. I didn't want a vacation in a big city or even a trip with friends. I just wanted to be alone somewhere peaceful. I found an off-grid cabin on a site for remote rentals. It was about 90 minutes outside of Bend, near a place called Crescent Lake. The photos showed a small, weathered wood cabin surrounded by trees, with no neighbors in sight. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and only solar panels for power. It looked like exactly what I needed, total disconnection. The host's description said it had a bed, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. Water came from a gravity-fed tank outside. It sounded primitive, but that's what I was looking for. I booked it for a full week in late July. I packed up my Forester with enough food, water, a sleeping bag, basic tools, a solar charger for my emergency phone, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a few books I hadn't read yet. The drive out there started on normal roads but got bumpier the closer I got. The last 10 miles were gravel and dirt. I didn't pass a single car. Trees grew close on either side of the road, and the sunlight flickered through the canopy in a way that made everything feel a little timeless. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly how it looked online. Small, a little crooked in the way that old buildings tend to be, but standing solid. It was maybe 30 feet by 20, with a little porch on the front. The windows had thick shutters propped open with sticks. The inside was dim but cozy. A small wood stove in the corner, a twin bed with a thick wool blanket, some shelves stocked with canned goods, a propane stove, and an old metal sink that drained into a gray water barrel underneath. The gravity-fed water tank was mounted on a platform outside, already half full. After unpacking, I settled in quickly. The air was dry and smelled like pine needles and warm sap. At night, it got cold fast, and I learned quickly how to get the wood stove going. The silence was deep, the kind you can feel pressing against your ears. No hum of a fridge, no traffic, no voices. I didn't mind. That first night, I slept like I hadn't in months. The first 2 days passed in slow, easy rhythms. I'd wake up with the light, boil water for coffee, walk along the small trails behind the cabin, read on the porch, and cook simple meals. There was a small stream a few minutes down the hill where I'd rinse out pots or splash water on my face. I didn't see a single person. It was perfect. But on the third day, small things started to feel slightly off. It started in the late afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, reading, when I heard something heavy move through the trees behind the cabin. Not a squirrel or a bird, something larger, maybe a deer. I didn't think much of it at first. There was plenty of wildlife around. But it was the way the sound stopped suddenly that gave me pause. 1 second it was there, branches snapping, underbrush shifting, and then silence. I stood up and scanned the trees, but I didn't see anything. That night, I brought the flashlight to bed with me. I left the shutters cracked open for air, and the moonlight spilled in softly. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, just a sharp, cold sense that something wasn't right. I stayed still and listened. It was dead quiet. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like gravel crunching. Just once. Then again, closer. It stopped. I sat up and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the window. Nothing. I stayed like that, barely breathing, for several minutes. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't really sleep. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin. There was a small patch of gravel in front of the porch, where my car was parked. I didn't see any clear footprints, but the surface was uneven and had plenty of indentations from past use. Could have been anything. An animal, a shifting rock. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard someone. That day, I went further down the trail behind the cabin. The path wasn't well worn, just a faint line through the trees. It eventually led to a narrow service road, overgrown and rough. I followed it for a few minutes, mostly out of curiosity, until I reached a small clearing where there was an old, rusted trailer sitting at the edge of the tree line. Its tires were flat, and moss covered most of its surface. There were no signs of recent activity, but the door was shut. I didn't approach it. Something about it just felt off. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. That night, the unease returned. I made a point to lock the door. Not that it would stop much, since it was just an old latch, but it made me feel a bit better. I kept the flashlight next to me again. Around midnight, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard the crunch again. This time, it wasn't just once. I heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. They moved from the side of the cabin to the back. I sat up and turned off the small solar lantern I had hanging from a hook. I waited, holding my breath. Then, I heard it, the faintest creak like weight on the back porch step. It was so quiet that it could have been imagined, but I didn't think so. I grabbed the flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it through the back window. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, still nothing. Eventually, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The forest was silent. I made a full circle around the cabin, flashlight beam swinging slowly over trees, brush, and gravel. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. There was a small pile of pine cones arranged on the porch rail. 5 of them stacked in a little pyramid. I hadn't put them there. I would have noticed something like that. I stared at them for a long time. Then I knocked them down and swept them into the dirt. I didn't know if it was someone messing with me or some kind of animal thing, but I felt exposed, like someone had come right up to the edge of where I slept. I spent the next few hours debating what to do. I still had 2 days left on the booking. Part of me wanted to stay. I didn't want to scare myself into cutting the trip short. But the other part, the louder part, told me I shouldn't ignore this. Something was happening. Whether it was a person or something else, it wasn't right. I made a plan. I would sleep in the cabin that night, but I'd park my car facing the road, with everything packed. If anything else happened, I'd leave immediately, even if it was in the middle of the night. I tried to distract myself during the day, went on another long walk, read, cooked, but everything felt off. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept checking the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling wouldn't leave. That night, I didn't turn the lights on. I stayed fully dressed, laying on top of the bed with the flashlight in one hand and a knife I'd brought for food prep in the other. It was a long time before anything happened, but it did. Just after 3 a.m., I heard something scrape along the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, then footsteps on the porch. Heavy, clear. The sound of someone standing just inches from the door. I didn't move. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might give me away. Then, a sound I'll never forget. The click of the latch being tested. Just once. Then silence. I bolted up, grabbed my bag, and slipped out the back door. I didn't use the flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. I moved fast but quiet, heart hammering in my ears, cutting through the trees to get around the cabin and reach the car. I jumped in, started it, and tore down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit paved road. When I finally pulled over, shaking, I checked the back seat, checked around the car. Nothing, but the fear was still there, wrapped around my ribs like wire. I didn't report it. What would I say? That I heard footsteps and saw a stack of pine cones? No one was hurt. Nothing was stolen. I just didn't want to deal with the questions. I never left a review, never contacted the host. I just went back to my rental in Bend and didn't tell anyone what happened. Weeks passed. I told myself it could have been a hunter, a squatter, someone camping illegally nearby. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty. Maybe it was some twisted local game. I don't know. I'll never know. But I do know I wasn't alone out there, and I'll never go back. It was the second week of October 2018 when I decided to spend a few quiet days in a remote cabin about 2 hours outside of Bend, Oregon. I had just turned 36 and felt worn out from the non-stop pace of my job as a commercial electrician in Portland. After back-to-back months of overtime and constant noise, I wanted silence, real silence. No cars, no phones, no people. Just trees and the sound of nothing. A friend of mine, Kevin, had a family cabin he never used. It was built by his grandfather back in the 60s and sat deep in the Deschutes National Forest, well off the paved road. Kevin gave me directions and the key. He told me it had no power, no running water, and barely any cell signal. It was what I was looking for. I packed my old Tacoma with a week's worth of canned food, water jugs, a camp stove, a sleeping bag, a hunting knife, a hatchet, a few flashlights, and some extra batteries. I also threw in a propane lantern, a small solar charger for emergencies, and a cooler packed with ice and a few frozen meals. I figured I'd read, hike, cook, sleep, and just take a real break from the world. That was all I wanted. The drive started smooth. I left just after sunrise, got coffee and gas, and made my way down Highway 97 until I turned off onto a long gravel road that led deeper into the forest. The trees thickened the farther I went, towering pines and firs rising on both sides like silent walls. My GPS lost signal about 15 minutes in, but I had printed directions from Kevin. I followed them carefully, counting the small trail crossings and landmarks he described. A big white boulder, a rusted old mailbox nailed to a tree, a sharp bend in the road near a dried-up creek. It all matched. Eventually, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat right in the center of it, looking exactly like I pictured. Small, made of weathered logs, with a pitched roof and a front porch with 2 sagging chairs. One of the windows was cracked. Moss climbed up the sides and across the stone chimney. Behind it was a small outhouse, and beyond that, nothing but trees in every direction. I parked beside the porch and stepped out. The silence hit me right away. Not even birds chirped, just wind moving through the trees. Felt heavier than I expected, like the forest was holding its breath. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool and musty. The cabin had one main room with a table, a wood stove, and a small kitchenette with old cabinets. A doorway led to a short hallway and a single bedroom at the back. There was a dusty mattress on a wooden frame, a dresser, and a mirror that had turned cloudy over time. I spent the first few hours cleaning. I swept, wiped down surfaces, and cleared out a few cobwebs. I unpacked what I needed and set up the lantern on the table. I chopped some kindling with the hatchet and stacked it beside the stove. By sundown, I had the place warm and cozy. I made a quick dinner of canned chili and crackers, read a bit by lantern light, and went to bed early. The first night passed without much trouble. I woke up a few times just from the silence. It's amazing how loud it feels when there's nothing at all, but I eventually slept. The next day, I went for a hike. I followed an old deer trail that led down to a small creek about a mile from the cabin. The trees here were thick and tall, and the ground was uneven with rocks and old roots. I filled one of my bottles at the creek and boiled the water back at the cabin. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, cooking, and writing a bit in a notebook I brought. It was peaceful. I didn't see or hear anyone. I didn't even hear a plane overhead. That night was calm again. On the third day, something started to feel different. I woke up just before dawn. The light coming in through the window was gray and cold. I got up to relieve myself outside, and as I stepped onto the porch, I saw something strange in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. There were tracks, footprints, human ones. At least they looked human, barefoot, deep, about 20 feet from the cabin, headed toward the tree-line. At first I thought maybe I was seeing things. I walked over and crouched to look. They were fresh. No way they had been there the day before. The toes, heel, and arches were all clear in the soft dirt. Whoever it was, they hadn't been wearing shoes, and they weren't mine. I had boots on every time I stepped outside. I followed the prints a bit. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin at a distance, then stopped. Just stopped. No prints going back. It was like someone came halfway around and vanished. I stood there, my skin crawling. I looked around at the forest. Still nothing. No movement. No sound. I called out once, not shouting, just a natural reaction. But the woods didn't answer. I stood still for a while, scanning the trees. Then I went back to the cabin and locked the door. That day I stayed close. I didn't hike. I didn't relax. I kept looking out the windows. Every few minutes I'd check again. I thought maybe I was just freaking myself out. Maybe it was a weird animal, or I had missed something logical. But deep down, I knew someone had been near the cabin, watching. That night I barely slept. I kept the lantern on. Every creak of the logs, every sound outside made me freeze. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I felt it. That sense that someone was nearby, watching. In the morning, I found more footprints. This time they were closer, right up to the porch steps. There were 2 new sets now, both barefoot, both coming from different directions. They met at the base of the stairs and then disappeared again. I checked my supplies. Nothing was missing. My food was untouched. The door was locked. But my sense of safety was gone. I thought about leaving, driving back to town and just forgetting about it. But something stubborn in me didn't want to give up the peace I came for. Maybe it was just someone messing around. Maybe a hiker who got lost. Maybe a kid from a nearby cabin I didn't know about. I told myself that a lot that day. I carried the hatchet with me the rest of the day. I kept it beside me while I read, while I cooked. I slept with it next to my sleeping bag that night. But again, I didn't hear anything. The next morning, the prints were gone. Washed away by wind, maybe, or whoever made them hadn't come back. I decided to stay one last night and leave early the next morning. I packed most of my gear that afternoon so I could leave at sunrise. That night, I kept the lantern on again. I lay in the sleeping bag fully clothed, boots on, jacket zipped. The hatchet sat beside me on the floor, and the flashlight was in my hand. I think I dozed off around midnight. I'm not sure for how long, but I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking. I froze. The door was locked. I had checked it twice. The sound wasn't loud, just a slow creak, like pressure on the wood. Then nothing. Then a faint shuffling sound, like fabric brushing across the floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. More silence. Then I heard one of the floorboards creak in the main room. I sat up slowly, flashlight aimed toward the hallway. I couldn't see anything through the doorway, just the edge of the wall and blackness beyond. Then I saw the shadow, just a shape, human height, not moving, standing just out of view. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, the shadow shifted, stepped backward, then silence again. A minute later, I heard the front door creak again, and then nothing. I stayed like that until the first light of morning. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I didn't breathe. When it was bright enough to see, I finally stood up and walked slowly to the main room. The door was closed, still locked. Everything looked exactly how I had left it. But the floor had a single wet footprint near the table. Barefoot, right foot, toes pointed toward the hallway. I packed the rest of my things in under 5 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I just got in the truck and drove. The road felt longer on the way out. Every time I passed a turnoff or a bend, I expected someone to be standing there. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I didn't even check my phone until I was an hour outside of Bend. When I got back to Portland, I returned the key to Kevin and told him I appreciated the cabin but wouldn't be going back. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. I still don't know who it was, or how they got in, or why they didn't take anything or hurt me. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe someone lives out there, surviving off-grid and doesn't like visitors. Maybe they were just curious, or waiting. What I do know is that I felt something out there that I'd never felt before. Not fear, not even danger. It was something colder, like knowing you're being watched not because someone wants to hurt you, but because they can. I've never gone back into deep forest alone since. I still hike sometimes, but only in parks with other people around. I still love the silence of nature, but now I know that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just hiding something, waiting,